When I was 14 years old, my parents threw my clothes onto the porch in garbage bags and handed me over to my uncle. They told me I was too stupid to live with my perfect twin sister Madison. They signed away their guardianship on the hood of a luxury car and drove away without looking back. 16 years later, right as my tech company was about to go public, they showed up in my lobby demanding money they claimed belonged to my sister. But when they finally saw the life I had built, they were left completely speechless. My name is Paige, and I am 30 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace. I sat at the head of a massive mahogany table in a glass-enclosed boardroom overlooking the vibrant city skyline. The expansive room was filled with elite investors, high-profile corporate attorneys, and my trusted executive team. We were in the critical final stages of reviewing the paperwork for the initial public offering of my medical supply chain technology company. It was the absolute culmination of years of relentless dedication, countless sleepless nights, and a highly complex vision that I had built entirely from scratch. The atmosphere in the room was electric and heavy with expectation. Thick binders of legal documents were stacked high across the table, and the digital projector displayed our final valuation numbers in bright financial charts. We were actively finalizing a multi-billion-dollar launch that would revolutionize the entire medical logistics industry. My chief operating officer was walking the skeptical underwriters through our projected growth margins for the next quarter, answering their aggressive questions with ease. I projected calm authority, nodding slowly as the lead bankers praised our robust distribution network. I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into proving my worth. I had spent the last decade working harder than anyone else, fighting to prove that I belonged in rooms exactly like this one. Then my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the polished wood of the table. I usually ignored all notifications and alerts during critical meetings, but my screen lit up with a text message from an unknown number. The preview text caught my eye and forced the breath directly from my lungs. The message read, "You are holding your sister's money. Sign over Uncle Thomas's assets now. We are downstairs in your lobby." I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. The sophisticated chatter of the corporate boardroom faded into a dull, distant buzz. I was suddenly no longer a 30-year-old chief executive officer about to ring the opening bell on Wall Street. I was instantly transported back to a crisp Friday afternoon when I was 14 years old, standing on the perfectly manicured lawn of a sprawling suburban estate. The memory was so intensely visceral, I could almost feel the cold autumn wind whipping against my face. My mother, Cynthia, was aggressively dragging 3 heavy black plastic garbage bags out of our pristine front door. She hurled them onto the concrete porch with unnecessary and theatrical force. Those cheap plastic bags contained every single piece of clothing, every school book, and every meager possession I owned in the entire world. Up on the second floor, my twin sister Madison stood behind the glass of her elegant bedroom window, watching the devastating scene unfold with a highly satisfied expression. Madison was the designated golden child, the perfect daughter, who played classical piano and brought home flawless report cards. I was the exact opposite in their eyes. I struggled terribly with reading assignments, failed my standardized tests, and constantly embarrassed my image-obsessed parents at their elite country club gatherings. Cynthia marched down the porch steps and grabbed my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. Her face was contorted with a toxic mixture of disgust and deep impatience. She looked at me not as a daughter, but as a defective piece of property she was finally allowed to throw away. "Your grades are dragging Madison's Ivy League profile down," she sneered, her harsh voice cutting sharply through the quiet suburban neighborhood. "We do not have money to throw out the window for an idiot. Uncle Thomas needs a warehouse cleaner. You are a better fit for that life." I remember turning my head desperately, looking toward the wide driveway for someone to intervene and stop this madness. My father Richard was standing next to his gleaming silver luxury sedan. He did not look at me. He did not offer a single word of comfort or even a basic explanation for why they were doing this. Instead, he was hastily scribbling his signature on a thick stack of legal documents resting on the hood of his expensive car. He was officially signing away his guardianship rights to the state. He handed the clipboard back to a waiting social worker, buttoned his tailored suit jacket with a look of immense relief, and got into the driver's seat. He started the engine and pulled out of the driveway without a single backward glance. Cynthia followed right behind him in her own vehicle. They drove away quickly, leaving a terrified and sobbing 14-year-old girl standing next to garbage bags completely discarded in favor of her supposedly brilliant twin sister. The sharp clatter of the ceramic coffee cup hitting a saucer pulled me sharply back to the present moment. The intense hum of the boardroom rushed back into my ears. The lead investor from a major venture capital firm was looking at me from across the long table, waiting for my final verbal approval on the equity distribution agreement. I looked down at the text message on my phone again. "We are downstairs in your lobby." For a fraction of a second, the old childhood trauma threatened to rise up in my chest and choke me. But I was no longer that frightened teenager shivering on a porch. I did not panic. I did not feel the crushing inadequacy that my parents had maliciously tried to brand me with. Instead, a cold, deeply calculated smile formed on my lips. I reached over and pressed the intercom button connecting me directly to the lobby security desk on the ground floor. "Send them up," I instructed the head of security, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of any emotion. I turned to my executive assistant standing by the heavy doors. "But turn on the boardroom recording system immediately and get my legal team on the line." This was the moment I had been preparing for over the last decade, and I was not going to let them control the narrative ever again. My name is Paige, and the heavy oak doors of the boardroom did not just open. They were violently shoved apart, slamming against the glass partitions with a deafening crash that echoed through the executive suite. My mother, Cynthia, marched in first, wearing an excessively branded designer coat that screamed of suburban country club desperation. She carried herself with the toxic entitlement of a woman who believed the world existed solely to cater to her whims. My father, Richard, followed closely behind her, his face flushed with an arrogant shade of red, gripping his expensive leather briefcase like a weapon. They completely ignored the room full of elite venture capitalists, seasoned investment bankers, and high-profile corporate attorneys. To them, I was not the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar tech company on the verge of a historic public offering. I was just the defective 14-year-old girl they had thrown away, and they fully expected me to cower in submission. "There you are, you ungrateful brat!" Cynthia shrieked, her shrill voice piercing the sophisticated atmosphere of the room. "You have been dodging our calls for weeks, Paige. You are going to sign over those assets today." The lead underwriter dropped his silver pen, staring at my parents in absolute disbelief. The entire room went dead silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard slammed his hands down on the polished mahogany table, right on top of our highly confidential corporate prospectus. "Did you hear your mother, Madison, is ready to open her private medical clinic, and we need the capital from Thomas's estate immediately. Stop playing businesswoman with these people and do what you are told right now." Cynthia pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, leaning aggressively over the expensive table. "You are just a lucky warehouse janitor who hit the jackpot because a senile old man felt sorry for you. That money belongs to someone with a real education, someone who actually worked hard and made something of herself like your twin sister." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at my chief operating officer and gave a subtle, commanding nod. "Gentlemen," I said to the bewildered executives, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and unbothered, "please excuse us for a few moments. Take a coffee break in the executive lounge down the hall. My security team will ensure your documents remain completely secure." The bankers and lawyers, sensing the explosive personal nature of the intrusion, quickly gathered their briefcases and filed out of the room without a single word of protest. Once the last attorney crossed the threshold, I stood up from my leather executive chair, walked over to the grand oak doors, and engaged the heavy deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. We were completely alone, isolated in the soundproof glass box, high above the city streets. I turned back to the two people who had contributed half of my genetic makeup and absolutely nothing to my success. Let us get a few facts straight before you embarrass yourselves any further. I began pacing slowly along the length of the empty boardroom table. When you dumped me at Uncle Thomas's warehouse 16 years ago, I did not just sweep the floors. I did not sit in the corner and cry over the family that so easily discarded me. Cynthia rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly, but I kept speaking, my voice cutting through her dismissive attitude like ice. By the time I turned 16, I had completely redesigned his entire national logistics network from the ground up. I built a proprietary tracking algorithm that optimized delivery routes and doubled his profit margins in just 8 months. Richard crossed his arms defensively, trying to maintain his fragile posture of superiority. You were a failing student. He spat out, his face twisting with disdain. You could barely read a basic high school textbook without needing extra help. I smiled, a genuine expression of pity for his profound ignorance. I have severe dyslexia, Richard. I was never stupid. My brain simply processes systemic information and spatial logic in a way your standardized tests could never measure. Uncle Thomas was the only person who actually paid attention to me. He took me to proper medical specialists. He got me the right educational resources and mentored me. He realized I possessed a genius-level aptitude for systems logic, while you two were busy buying Madison another pair of designer shoes just for memorizing flashcards. I stopped pacing and stood directly across from them, resting my hands firmly on the mahogany table. Uncle Thomas saw my worth when you only saw a burden. That is exactly why before he passed away, he legally willed the entire holding company and all of its subsidiary assets directly to me, not to you, not to your precious golden child, Madison. Richard let out a loud, mocking laugh, shaking his head in absolute disgust. Thomas was an absolute fool, Richard sneered, his voice dripping with elitist contempt. He ran a dirty, blue-collar warehouse and died a lonely old man. He had no idea what real prestige was. Madison is going to be a top-tier physician, saving lives and building a real respectable legacy for this family. She needs that clinic capital right now, and we are not leaving this building until you liquidate that garbage estate and wire the funds into her account. I maintained steady, unbroken eye contact with Richard as I reached into my leather briefcase, resting on the chair beside me. I pulled out a thick, securely bound financial dossier and slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany table. The heavy folder glided across the wood and stopped perfectly right in front of Cynthia's hands. You say Madison needs money for a private medical clinic? I asked, allowing a sharp, chilling laugh to escape my lips. That is absolutely hilarious. Cynthia frowned, her eyes darting nervously from my face down to the thick manila folder. What is this nonsense? She demanded, refusing to touch the document. I leaned forward, planting my palms on the table and lowering my voice into a deadly precise whisper. Open it. Because the last time your precious golden child actually paid tuition to medical school was exactly 6 years ago. Cynthia and Richard froze completely, the color draining instantly from their faces as my words hung heavily in the chilled boardroom air. Cynthia's trembling hand finally reached out, her meticulously manicured fingers hovering over the heavy manila cover before flipping it open. Her eyes darted rapidly across the official university transcripts, the repeated academic probation notices, and the final irrefutable expulsion letter stamped with the dean's signature from exactly 6 years prior. The pristine, carefully cultivated illusion of her perfect daughter was dissolving right in front of her eyes. Richard leaned heavily over her shoulder, his arrogant, puffed-out posture collapsing instantly as he read the undeniable proof. They had been aggressively funding a ghost for over half a decade, pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into an education that simply did not exist. The boardroom was dead silent, the weight of their profound gullibility pressing down on them. Before either of them could utter a single word of defense, denial, or outrage, the heavy oak boardroom doors were violently thrown open for a second time. Madison practically threw herself into the room. She was 30 years old, dressed in an immaculate designer outfit, but she entered with the precise, practiced hysteria of a spoiled toddler who had been denied a toy. Fake tears streamed down her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup in a way she surely calculated would look tragic and sympathetic. She gasped for air, clutching her chest, as if she had just survived a horrific physical ordeal. "Mom! Dad, you have to stop her!" Madison wailed, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls of the executive suite. "Paige is trying to ruin my entire life. She is making up horrible, disgusting lies about me to your friends because she has always been so incredibly jealous of my success. She is trying to steal the clinic money that I rightfully deserve to start my practice." Madison rushed to our parents' side, fully expecting to be pulled into a comforting, protective embrace. She expected them to turn their combined vicious wrath back onto me, just like they had done every single day of our childhood whenever she spun a fabricated story. But Cynthia and Richard did not move to comfort her. They did not even look at her face. They were staring blankly down at the open dossier on the mahogany table. The official expulsion letter from the prestigious medical university was resting right next to Cynthia's shaking hand. Madison followed their gaze downward. Her tearful, victimized expression vanished in an absolute instant. The transformation was deeply chilling to witness. The sobbing, fragile golden child completely evaporated, instantly replaced by a cornered, venomous predator. All the years of fake perfection, the carefully constructed lies, the stolen money, and the fabricated medical career had just been exposed in bright, unforgiving, fluorescent light. Madison realized with sudden, violent clarity that she could no longer manipulate her way out of this room. The undeniable proof of her massive fraud was sitting right there in black and white ink, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She let out a guttural scream, a sound of absolute fury, and lunged across the polished mahogany table directly at me. Her arm raised high, her hand curled into a rigid claw, aiming a violent, desperate slap right at my face. I did not flinch, I did not even blink, I did not need to. From the adjoining private glass office, the connecting door slid open with a soft, metallic swoosh. Liam moved with the terrifying, silent speed of a man completely in control of his environment. He was 33 years old, impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, and possessed a formidable physical presence that demanded immediate, unquestioned respect. He was not just my husband. He was a brilliant, self-made billionaire hedge fund manager who had conquered the ruthless financial world through sheer intellect, strategic foresight, and unyielding discipline. Before Madison's manicured hand could even come close to striking my face, Liam's large, steady hand shot out and intercepted her wrist mid-air. The sudden impact made a sharp smack in the quiet room, but Liam did not move a single muscle in response. He neutralized the physical threat effortlessly, his grip firm and immovable, stopping her aggressive momentum dead in its tracks. He did not hurt her, but he held her wrist with an iron strength that made it perfectly undeniably clear that she was completely powerless against him. "I strongly suggest you reconsider your next move," Liam said. His voice was dangerously calm, a deep, resonant baritone that commanded total silence and absolute compliance. He slowly pushed her arm back, forcing Madison to stumble backward away from the table and away from me. Cynthia, completely blind to the reality of the situation and thoroughly ignorant of who Liam actually was, immediately went on the offensive. Her toxic maternal entitlement flared up aggressively, overriding the shocking revelation of Madison's academic fraud. She stepped in front of Madison, shielding her precious failure of a daughter, and turned her visceral classist rage toward my husband. "How dare you touch her!" Cynthia shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that made the glass partitions vibrate. "Take your hands off my daughter right this second. Who do you think you are? You are nothing but a hired thug. Paige, tell your lowly bodyguard to back off before we have him arrested for assault and thrown in a cell where he belongs. You think because you have a little bit of money now you can hire goons to intimidate your real family? You are absolutely pathetic." Richard puffed out his chest, stepping up beside his wife to intimidate the man he assumed was just a glorified minimum-wage bouncer. "You heard her," Richard barked, pointing a trembling finger at Liam's chest. Step outside and wait in the hallway with the rest of the hired help. This is a private family matter, and you have absolutely no business being in this room. You lay a finger on my daughter again, and I will personally use my connections to see to it that you never work in this city again." Liam did not raise his voice. He did not look intimidated by their empty, pathetic threats. He simply adjusted his tailored cuffs and looked at my parents with an expression of profound, chilling amusement. He glanced down at me, a silent, knowing communication passing between us. We both knew that the trap had been perfectly, flawlessly set, and my biological family had just walked blindly into the very center of it with their egos leading the way. Before Liam could even begin to introduce himself and verbally dismantle Richard's ridiculous threats, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom opened for the third and final time. The room went completely still. Even Cynthia stopped shrieking, turning her head toward the noise. A man walked into this boardroom, stepping confidently onto the plush corporate carpet. He was 32 years old, tall and impeccably groomed in a sharp, tailored navy blue suit. His name was Jamal, and he was an elite, highly respected financial auditor from one of the most prestigious accounting firms in the nation. He carried a silver digital tablet under his arm, his posture radiating quiet authority, sharp intellect, and absolute professionalism. He was also Madison's husband. Jamal took 2 steps into the room and stopped cold. His intelligent eyes swept across the chaotic scene, his wife breathing heavily and looking frantic, my parents standing in defensive, aggressive postures, and me sitting calmly at the head of the table next to Liam. Jamal had absolutely no idea what he was walking into. He had simply been doing his job. Madison turned around. The moment she locked eyes with Jamal, the remaining color completely drained from her face. She turned deathly pale, her skin taking on the sickly, translucent hue of absolute terror. Her jaw dropped slightly, but her voice completely failed her. The aggressive, violent predator from just a few seconds ago vanished into thin air, replaced by a woman who realized her kingdom of lies had just been breached by the one person she had been deceiving the most. Jamal stood frozen in the doorway, his polished leather shoes sinking into the thick corporate carpet. He gripped his silver tablet tightly, his highly analytical mind struggling to process the bizarre scene unfolding in front of him. He was a senior forensic auditor at one of the top 4 accounting firms in the country. He had been explicitly hired as an independent contractor to conduct the final rigorous pre-IPO financial review for this exact medical logistics company. He expected to walk into a room of quiet executives and crunch complex valuation numbers. He absolutely did not expect to find his wife, his highly toxic in-laws, and a tense physical altercation playing out in the center of the executive suite. Jamal's gaze darted from the tall man in the charcoal suit who was firmly releasing his wife's wrist to his incredibly arrogant father-in-law Richard, and finally to the woman sitting with absolute authority at the head of the table. He had only ever communicated with the CEO via email and formal video calls using her married name. Seeing her in person now, the physical resemblance was undeniable. She shared his wife's facial features, but that was where the similarities abruptly ended. The woman at the table possessed a razor-sharp focus and a quiet, terrifying power that Madison completely lacked. Madison's initial paralysis finally broke. A visceral panic flooded her eyes as her carefully constructed reality began to violently cave in. She scrambled toward Jamal, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor bordering the carpet. She grabbed his arm with desperate clawing fingers, digging her acrylic nails into the fine fabric of his tailored suit jacket. She tried to use her body weight to physically drag him backward toward the heavy oak doors, desperate to pull him away from the undeniable truth sitting on the table. "Jamal, we have to leave right now." Madison stammered, her voice a frantic, breathless whisper that echoed loudly in the silent room. She positioned herself between him and the rest of the room, attempting to aggressively block his line of sight. "You cannot be here. This woman is completely insane. She is a dangerous, jealous drug addict who has been stalking my family for years. She is obsessed with me and my medical career. We need to call the police and get out of this building before she does something violent." Cynthia eagerly jumped in to support the fabricated narrative, completely oblivious to the fact that Jamal was here on official business. "Listen to your wife, Jamal," Cynthia commanded, using the exact same condescending, dismissive tone she always used when addressing him at their miserable family dinners. "This girl is deeply disturbed. She is a low-class criminal trying to extort us. Be a good, obedient husband and escort Madison to the car immediately while Richard and I handle this trash." But Jamal did not move. He was a man whose entire professional existence revolved around identifying discrepancies, uncovering hidden truths, and analyzing raw facts. He planted his feet firmly on the floor, making himself an immovable object against Madison's frantic pulling. He slowly looked down at his wife's sweating face, noting the wild-cornered desperation in her eyes. Then he looked past her shoulder to the head of the table. Paige was leaning back in her leather executive chair, her hands steepled together in a gesture of total relaxation. She was not acting like a crazed addict or a desperate stalker. She exuded the unmistakable aura of a billionaire chief executive officer, completely in control of her domain. The man standing beside her, the one Cynthia had just insulted as a lowly bodyguard, wore a bespoke suit and a watch that Jamal instantly recognized as a limited edition piece worth more than Richard's entire suburban estate. The contrast between Madison's hysterical, sloppy lies and the cold, hard reality of the boardroom was violently stark. Jamal gently but firmly removed Madison's hands from his arm. He bypassed her completely, stepping deeper into the boardroom until he stood directly next to the polished mahogany table. His eyes locked onto the open manila folder resting near Cynthia's shaking hands. It was the financial dossier Paige had thrown down just moments ago. The bold red stamp from a prestigious medical university caught his attention. It was an official expulsion letter. Jamal picked up the heavy dossier. The room remained suffocatingly quiet as he read the crisp black text. The letter detailed severe academic probation, followed by a complete and final dismissal from the medical program due to failing grades and chronic absenteeism. He checked the date at the top of the official university letterhead. The expulsion had occurred exactly 6 years ago. A suffocating, agonizing wave of realization crashed over him. For the past 3 years, Jamal had been draining his personal savings, working grueling 80-hour weeks, and taking on massive amounts of debt to fund what he genuinely believed was Madison's highly demanding medical residency. His in-laws had constantly belittled his background, demanding he work harder to support a future prominent physician who was supposedly out of his league. He had sacrificed his own peace and financial stability for a career that literally did not exist. Every late-night study session she claimed to have, every expensive textbook fee, every networking trip, it was all a massive coordinated illusion. Jamal set the dossier back down on the table with deliberate, terrifying slowness. He tapped the screen of his silver tablet, his fingers flying across the digital keyboard as he pulled up his own encrypted financial files. As a top-tier auditor, his personal accounts were meticulously categorized. He accessed the joint accounts and the specific high-limit credit lines he had dedicated entirely to her supposed educational and living expenses. He ran a rapid diagnostic search matching the dates of her expulsion with the skyrocketing withdrawals. He turned back to face his wife. The professional, composed auditor was gone, replaced by a man staring at a total stranger who had financially and emotionally bled him dry. "Madison," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a low, trembling register that demanded absolute attention and cut through the tension in the room like a scalpel. "If you dropped out of medical school 6 years ago, why does my forensic credit card statement show $150,000 in residency expenses routed directly to underground casinos and luxury designer boutiques?" Madison opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She choked on her own breath, her face turning a mottled shade of red as she backed away from him, completely paralyzed by the inescapable weight of her own deception. Madison could not formulate a single syllable. Her perfectly glossed lips parted, but all that emerged was a shallow, panicked gasp. She took another unsteady step backward, her expensive heels scraping against the polished hardwood floor, physically retreating from the devastating truth illuminated on Jamal's tablet. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, a heavy vacuum waiting to be filled. But rather than offering an explanation, a tearful apology, or even a fabricated excuse, Cynthia decided to do what she had always done best. She attacked. Cynthia stepped smoothly in front of her cowering daughter, her posture instantly shifting from defensive to violently offensive. She squared her shoulders, tilting her chin up to look down her nose at the man who had financially supported her family's delusions for years. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. She did not see a brilliant financial auditor or a betrayed husband. She saw a target that needed to be neutralized. "How dare you speak to my daughter in that tone?" Cynthia shrieked, the sharp pitch of her voice echoing unpleasantly off the glass walls. "You march into this private meeting and immediately start throwing wild accusations around, like you have some kind of authority here. You are nothing but a glorified accountant who spends his days staring blindly at spreadsheets. Madison is a visionary. She is building a medical empire, and the financial complexities of her practice are clearly far beyond your basic comprehension. You should be thanking your lucky stars every single day that a beautiful, educated woman from a prominent family even looked your way." Jamal stared at his mother-in-law, his highly analytical mind processing her words with chilling precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not take the bait. He simply waited for her to finish digging her own grave. He could feel the cool gaze of Paige and Liam from the head of the table, silent witnesses to the unraveling of a profoundly toxic family. But Cynthia was just getting started. She crossed her arms over her designer coat, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. "Let us be completely honest for once, Jamal. You know exactly why your firm hired you. You are just a lucky diversity hire who got pushed up the corporate ladder to fill a quota. You come from nothing, and you brought absolutely nothing to this family except a paycheck. You are a walking public relations stunt for your accounting firm." Madison significantly lowered her standards to give you a taste of real class, of real society, and this is how you repay her, by hacking into her private accounts and questioning her business expenses. You are entirely pathetic. The vicious racist and classist remarks hung in the air, toxic and heavy. For 3 excruciating years, Jamal had bent over backward to appease Cynthia and Richard. He had drained his hard-earned savings to pay for Madison's lavish lifestyle, fully believing he was supporting a brilliant, overworked medical resident dedicated to saving lives. He had swallowed his pride at their elitist country club dinners, biting his tongue until it bled every time Richard made a subtle, condescending joke about his background, his neighborhood, or his rapid rise in the financial sector. He had paid for their extravagant anniversary gifts, covered the sudden unexplained shortfalls in their mortgage, and funded the luxury vehicle Madison claimed she desperately needed for her grueling hospital commutes. He had done it all because he believed he was building a life with a genuine partner. He believed he was earning his place in a family that was just a bit rough around the edges and fiercely protective of their own. Now staring at Cynthia's sneering face and Madison's cowardly silence, Jamal experienced a brutal, earth-shattering awakening. The fog of love and familial obligation instantly evaporated, leaving behind a landscape of absolute clarity. His entire marriage was not a partnership. It was a highly calculated financial scam built entirely on racial microaggressions and pathological lies. He had been targeted. He was a mark, a walking bank account designed specifically to fund Madison's secret addictions and her parents' desperate need to maintain their wealthy facade. The late nights she claimed to be at the hospital saving lives were actually spent gambling away his bonus checks at high-stakes tables. The massive residency fees were funneled directly into designer handbags, luxury spa retreats, and vacations he was never invited on. Jamal looked slowly past Cynthia, locking his dark, intense eyes onto Madison. He gave her one final chance to speak, one last opportunity to defend him against her mother's vile attack, to show a single shred of genuine humanity or remorse. But Madison simply averted her gaze, staring at the floorboards hiding behind the expensive fabric of her mother's coat. She chose the lie. She chose the scam. The realization did not break Jamal. It forged him into steel. The deep well of anxiety and confusion he had been carrying for months completely vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating efficiency of an elite forensic auditor who had just uncovered a massive fraud. He tapped the power button on his tablet, the screen going black, and slipped it smoothly under his arm. He stood perfectly straight, his posture radiating a quiet, dangerous power that made Cynthia involuntarily take a half step backward. Richard, however, was entirely incapable of reading the room. Seeing his wife lose her momentum, he decided it was his turn to reassert control. He had spent his entire life bullying people into submission, and he fully expected Jamal to fold under his aggressive pressure. Richard puffed out his chest, his face red with arrogant fury, and stormed across the room until he was standing just inches away from Jamal. He invaded Jamal's personal space, trying to use his height and volume to physically intimidate the younger man. Richard jabbed a thick, aggressive finger directly into the center of Jamal's chest. The physical contact was a massive mistake, but Richard was too blinded by his own toxic entitlement to realize it. He leaned in close, his voice a low, menacing threat intended to instill absolute terror. "You listen to me very carefully," Richard growled, his face twisted with malice. "I do not care what you think you saw on that little screen of yours. You are going to turn around, walk out of this building, and keep your mouth completely shut. You will pay off whatever debts my daughter has accumulated, and you will do it with a smile on your face. Because if you breathe a single word of this to anyone, if you try to embarrass my family or divorce my daughter, I will personally ruin you. I will use every single connection I have at my country club. I play golf with the senior partners at your firm. You cross me, and I will have you fired, blacklisted, and completely unemployable by tomorrow morning." Jamal looked down at the thick, aggressive finger pressing into his chest. He did not flinch, nor did he cower. Slowly, deliberately, Jamal raised his hand and brushed Richard's finger away, as if swatting a particularly bothersome insect. Jamal straightened his suit jacket, his expression completely devoid of fear. He looked Richard dead in the eye and delivered a single devastating sentence. "My firm's senior partners do not play golf with men whose credit lines are maxed out to fund their daughter's gambling addictions, Richard." Without waiting for a response, Jamal turned on his heel. He did not look at Madison. He did not look at Cynthia. He simply walked toward the heavy oak doors, his posture rigid and uncompromising, leaving his fraudulent marriage dead on the boardroom floor. The sound of the door clicking shut behind Jamal severed the last tether of Richard's self-control. His face, already flushed a deep crimson, turned an alarming shade of purple. Stripped of his ability to intimidate his son-in-law, his fragile ego violently sought another target. He whipped around, his furious gaze locking onto me at the head of the mahogany table. The vein in his forehead throbbed visibly as he marched toward my end of the room, slamming his fists down onto the polished wood. "You think you have one page?" Richard snarled, spit flying from his lips. "You think you can just sit there in your fancy little chair and destroy my family? You think you can withhold Uncle Thomas's money and ruin my daughter's life without facing any consequences?" I remained perfectly still, my expression utterly placid. Liam shifted his weight slightly beside me, a silent guardian ready to intervene, but I placed a gentle hand on his knee, signaling him to hold back. I wanted Richard to dig the hole as deep as possible. "I know exactly what is going on here," Richard continued, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous executive suite. "You are taking this company public next month. An initial public offering. Hundreds of millions of dollars on the line. Investors looking at every single detail of your life. It would be a real tragedy if the financial press suddenly received an anonymous tip about the CEO of this highly anticipated tech firm." Cynthia caught on to her husband's strategy, instantly stepping up beside him with a cruel, triumphant sneer. "That is right," she hissed. "We will tell them everything. We will go to the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Forbes. We will tell them you are a deeply disturbed drug addict. We will say you manipulated a senile old man into changing his will. We will fabricate whistleblowers claiming you embezzled funds to start this entire operation. We will drag your name through the mud until your stock price hits rock bottom before the bell even rings on opening day." Richard slammed his hand on the table again for emphasis. "You are going to sign over every single asset from Uncle Thomas's estate right now. You are going to wire the cash to Madison's account immediately. If you do exactly as you are told, we will stay quiet. If you refuse, I will personally make sure your precious IPO goes up in flames and you lose every single thing you have built." The threat hung in the chilled, air-conditioned air of the boardroom. Richard and Cynthia stood shoulder to shoulder, panting, slightly looking incredibly proud of their extortion attempt. They fully expected me to crack. They expected the scared, discarded 14-year-old girl to finally surface and beg for their mercy. Instead, I looked at Richard's red, furious face. I looked at Cynthia's desperate, manicured posture, and I laughed. It was not a nervous giggle or a polite chuckle. It was a genuine, deep, chilling sound that echoed off the soundproof glass walls. It was the laugh of a predator watching its prey enthusiastically walk directly into a slaughterhouse. The sound was so jarring, so entirely devoid of fear, that it made my parents physically recoil. The triumphant sneers melted off their faces, replaced by a sudden creeping unease. I let the laughter slowly subside, though a cold smile remained etched on my face. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table, and locked my gaze onto Richard's terrified eyes. "Ruin my company?" I asked, keeping my voice deceptively soft and conversational. "Go right ahead, Richard. Pick up your phone right now, dial the press. Tell them whatever fantastic fictional stories you want. But before you dial the press, you might want to call your bank and check who currently holds the deed to your beloved mansion." Richard scoffed loudly, attempting to mask his sudden sharp panic with a thick layer of bluster. He waved his hand dismissively in the air. "You are bluffing," Richard barked, his voice lacking its previous authoritative thunder. "My mortgage is perfectly secure. I have owned that property for decades. It is the premier estate in the most exclusive neighborhood in the state. I am a wealthy, respected man, and my finances are absolutely none of your business. You cannot touch my home." I did not say a word. I smoothly picked up the small, sleek remote control resting next to my briefing documents. I pointed it at the ceiling and tapped a single button. The heavy, automated blinds covering the floor-to-ceiling windows silently descended, plunging the room into shadow. A moment later, the massive digital projector mounted above the mahogany table hummed to life. A stark, brilliant light hit the blank wall directly behind me. The screen illuminated with a highly detailed, complex corporate acquisition tree. It was a web of financial routing showing dummy corporations holding firms and vast debt acquisitions. I watched Richard's eyes dart across the screen, tracking the flow of the glowing red lines. The graphic clearly displayed his severe, chronically overdue mortgage. It showed that his estate was massively underwater, suffocating under second and third loans taken out to fund Madison's fake lifestyle. But the truly devastating part was the very top of the organizational chart. The bright red lines traced the purchase of his defaulted debt from his original bank, routing it through a series of anonymous shell companies. All of those lines converged into a single, undeniable point at the apex of the screen. The holding company that now completely owned Richard's severely overdue underwater mortgage was entirely owned by me. Richard stared at the glowing projection screen, his mouth opening and closing in a grotesque imitation of a suffocating fish. The arrogant bluster that had defined his entire existence completely vanished, instantly replaced by the hollow, terrified look of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on rapid quicksand. The bright red lines on the corporate organizational chart, connecting his defaulted underwater mortgage directly to my private holding company, reflected brightly in his wide, panicking eyes. He could not form a coherent sentence. The realization that the daughter he had spent decades treating like disposable garbage now literally owned the roof over his head paralyzed his vocal cords. I did not say another word. I simply pressed a button on the sleek console, silently raising the heavy boardroom blinds, letting the harsh, unforgiving city sunlight wash away the projection. I sat back in my leather chair and watched with cold satisfaction as my corporate security team escorted my completely silent, utterly defeated biological parents out of the glass-walled building. Fast forward exactly 1 month. The corporate financial world moves at breakneck speed, and in those 4 rapid weeks, my company successfully finalized the preliminary stages of our historic initial public offering, solidifying my unchallenged position in the logistics industry. But while I was busy securing massive international contracts and expanding our automated warehouse networks, Cynthia and Richard were rapidly suffocating under the crushing, undeniable reality of their imminent bankruptcy. The legal foreclosure notices on their sprawling suburban estate were no longer just polite banking threats. They were binding, aggressive deadlines marching closer with every sunrise. A rational family facing such monumental ruin would have immediately downsized, liquidated whatever minor assets remained, and humbly accepted the severe consequences of funding Madison's massive 6-year academic fraud. My parents, however, were fundamentally incapable of experiencing humility. They absolutely refused to surrender their elite zip code or admit defeat. Instead of packing cardboard boxes and consulting bankruptcy attorneys, they doubled down on their delusions. They orchestrated a spectacularly desperate, hyper-lavish event they audaciously dubbed their anniversary banquet. They booked the grand ballroom of the most exclusive, ridiculously expensive 5-star restaurant in the downtown district, ensuring the menu featured imported caviar and vintage champagne. They sent out invitations to every wealthy socialite, country club associate, and local politician they had ever rubbed shoulders with. This extravagant party was not a celebration of enduring love. It was nothing but an elaborate, highly calculated grift. Their strategy was to leverage their remaining fragile social capital to pitch a phenomenal exclusive investment opportunity to their affluent peers. They fully intended to solicit millions of dollars in aggressive seed funding to launch Madison's groundbreaking new medical startup. The startup, of course, was entirely fictitious. Madison was not a doctor, let alone a medical innovator. The real sinister objective of this elegant banquet was to collect massive investment checks from their gullible friends, illegally funnel the capital through untraceable dummy accounts, and secretly pay off the severely overdue mortgage that I currently held. It was a spectacular display of criminal desperation wrapped tightly in silk table linens and desperate vanity. I was sitting in my corner office reviewing our final quarter revenue projections when my executive assistant walked in carrying a thick, heavy envelope. It stood out grotesquely against the sterile, streamlined efficiency of my modern workspace. The paper was textured, exceptionally heavy cardstock, completely sealed with a ridiculous, archaic dollop of crimson wax. I broke the brittle seal and pulled out the invitation. It was excessively decorated with heavy gold embossing, proudly announcing the grand milestone celebration of Richard and Cynthia's enduring marriage. But it was not the elegant printed calligraphy that caught my immediate attention. Tucked inside the rigid card was a single folded piece of personalized stationery. I recognized my mother's sharp, aggressive handwriting immediately. The message was not a desperate plea for financial forgiveness, nor was it a request for a quiet family truce. It was a staggering display of toxic narcissism, completely disconnected from the harsh reality that she was on the verge of losing her luxurious home. The handwritten note read, "Bring a $1 million check tonight, or you will never be allowed to call me mother again." I stared at the ultimatum, genuinely marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of a woman who believed her maternal title held a massive financial price tag, let alone one I would ever be willing to pay. She had long ago forfeited the right to that title, continuously substituting genuine affection with conditional approval and endless financial demands. The idea that she viewed her relationship with me as a premium subscription service that required a 7-figure renewal fee was both hilarious and deeply pathetic. I slid the gold-embossed card and the venomous note across the sleek surface of my desk. Liam caught the heavy paper effortlessly, his dark eyes quickly scanning Cynthia's ridiculous threat. A cold, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. He looked up at me, his silent support absolute and unwavering. We had spent the last 4 weeks entirely ignoring their frantic phone calls, their aggressive voicemails, and their desperate legal posturing. But this public banquet, this highly calculated attempt to actively scam their inner circle using a fake medical clinic as lucrative bait, required a definitive explosive response. We were not going to stay home in our penthouse and let them victimize innocent investors to fund their pathetic delusions. We were going to accept the invitation. We were going to step directly into the bright spotlight they had so carefully arranged and permanently burn their kingdom of lies to the ground, leaving nothing but ash for everyone to see. I picked up my cell phone, my resolve hardening into unbreakable ice. "Call Jamal," I said, looking directly at Liam. "Tell him it's time." The evening of the anniversary banquet arrived with a chilling, crisp breeze sweeping through the downtown financial district. The chosen venue, an internationally renowned culinary institution, known for its exorbitant pricing and exclusive wait lists, sat at the end of a cobblestone street. It was a fortress of superficial prestige, exactly the kind of place Richard and Cynthia needed to project their desperate illusion of untouchable wealth. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open the doors of luxury sedans and imported sports cars, catering to a crowd entirely unaware they were walking into a meticulously orchestrated financial trap. When our private car glided to a halt at the curb, Liam and I stepped out into the flashing lights of the restaurant's grand entryway. I had not dressed to blend in with my mother's gaudy social circle. I had dressed to completely obliterate them. There were no flashy designer logos plastered across my clothing, no massive ostentatious diamonds screaming for attention. I wore a bespoke midnight blue silk gown, tailored to absolute perfection, draped with a structured, sharp-shouldered cashmere blazer. It was the purest manifestation of quiet luxury and aesthetic that spoke of generational power and unshakable confidence. Beside me, Liam wore a midnight charcoal tuxedo that perfectly mirrored my dark, commanding energy. We did not look like guests arriving at a party. We looked like executioners arriving at a tribunal. Cynthia's closet full of brand-name seasonal trends would look spectacularly cheap standing next to us. We bypassed the crowded valet stand and walked through the heavy revolving glass doors into the restaurant's expansive marble lobby. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted truffles. Standing near the velvet-roped entrance to the private event halls, completely separated from the chattering crowds, was Jamal. He had undergone a profound transformation since the explosive confrontation in the boardroom. The exhausted, bewildered husband, who had been emotionally and financially drained by Madison, was completely gone. In his place stood a top-tier forensic auditor, radiating cold, precise authority. He wore a razor-sharp, double-breasted gray suit, his posture straight and unyielding. Tucked securely under his right arm was a thick, heavy manila envelope. I knew exactly what that envelope contained. It held the meticulously organized, irrefutable documentation of Madison's massive financial embezzlement, the fraudulent medical school receipts, and the absolute proof of Richard's imminent catastrophic bankruptcy. It was the match that would ignite their entire fake empire. Jamal stepped forward to meet us as we crossed the polished marble floor. There was no need for pleasantries or empty small talk. We shared a long, silent look of absolute, unwavering solidarity. We were three professionals who operated in the realms of hard facts, brutal truths, and systemic logic, preparing to face a family drowning in pathological lies. Jamal adjusted his grip on the heavy manila envelope and looked directly into my eyes, a fierce, determined gleam illuminating his expression. "Ready to end this?" Jamal asked, his voice steady and remarkably calm. "It ended the moment they sent that invitation," I replied, smoothing the lapel of my cashmere blazer. "Tonight is just the burial." With Jamal flanking my right side and Liam anchoring my left, we walked down the heavily carpeted corridor leading to the grand ballroom. Muffled applause and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes echoed through the thick, soundproofed walls. Two uniformed ushers stood at attention outside the towering gilded double doors. They moved to ask for our invitations, but Liam simply offered a cold, dismissive glance that immediately froze them in place. Without waiting for an introduction or an announcement, I reached out and pushed the heavy wooden doors wide open. The scene inside the grand ballroom was a spectacular display of desperate bleeding capital. Massive floral arrangements towered over tables covered in pristine white linens. Waiters in white gloves circulated through the crowd, balancing silver trays piled high with imported caviar and top-shelf champagne. Hundreds of wealthy investors, country club socialites, and local elite were seated in the lavishly decorated space, completely oblivious to the fact that they were being aggressively courted for a massive fraudulent scam to save a foreclosed mansion. At the very front of the room, standing on a raised, brightly lit stage, was Cynthia. She was draped in a sequined, aggressively bright red designer gown that screamed for attention, clutching a microphone with both hands. She was in the middle of a highly rehearsed, deeply manipulative performance. Her voice trembled with fake emotion as she paced across the stage, actively milking every ounce of sympathy from her wealthy, gullible audience. "It has been a journey of profound heartache," Cynthia projected into the microphone, her tone dripping with manufactured sorrow. "As many of you know, Richard and I have endured the agonizing pain of a tragic, estranged daughter. We poured our hearts into her, but some souls are simply lost to darkness and rebellion. Through that unimaginable grief, we found the strength to channel our love into something pure. We found the strength to build a legacy of healing through Madison's brilliant new medical venture." The crowd murmured in sympathetic agreement, completely captivated by the tragic narrative of a wealthy mother enduring the shame of a failed child. I stood just inside the doorway, flanked by Liam and Jamal, letting the sheer absurdity of her lies wash over me. I did not hide in the shadows. I stepped forward into the warm glow of the ballroom chandeliers, my midnight blue silk catching the light. From the stage, Cynthia's eyes scanned the room, soaking up the adulation and pity of her wealthy peers. As she turned toward the back of the hall, her gaze abruptly slammed into me. She saw the bespoke clothing, the unbothered posture, the billionaire husband standing at my side, and the elite auditor holding the envelope of her destruction. For a fraction of a second, genuine shock flashed across her heavily contoured face. But her toxic narcissism was a powerful, blinding shield. She saw my presence not as a threat, but as a total capitulation. She genuinely believed her ridiculous ultimatum had worked. She believed I had walked into this room, carrying a $1 million check, thoroughly broken and desperate to buy back her toxic maternal affection, to save myself from public embarrassment. A wicked, triumphant smile split Cynthia's face, completely shattering her grieving mother routine. She gripped the microphone tightly, her eyes locked onto mine with predatory glee, and brought the device right back up to her lips. "Ladies and gentlemen, please look to the back of the room," Cynthia announced, her voice amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system echoing with a sickening manufactured sweetness that masked her absolute malice. She threw her arm out dramatically, pointing her manicured finger directly at me as I stood perfectly framed by the gilded double doors. "Here is our troubled, wayward daughter finally returning to beg for our family's forgiveness." The effect was instantaneous. A collective gasp rippled through the grand ballroom. The soft, elegant music of the string quartet ground to a sudden, discordant halt. Hundreds of wealthy socialites, aggressive venture capitalists, and elite country club members simultaneously turned in their velvet-upholstered chairs to stare at the back of the hall. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased entirely, replaced by a wave of hushed, scandalized whispering. These were people who thrived on high society drama, and Cynthia had just served them a prime cut of orchestrated humiliation. They looked at me, expecting to see exactly what my mother had described, a broken, desperate, heavily indebted woman crawling back to her wealthy parents to plead for financial salvation and a second chance. I did not flinch. I did not avert my eyes, nor did I shrink back into the shadows of the corridor. I took a slow, deep breath of the truffle-scented air, squared my shoulders in my bespoke midnight blue cashmere blazer, and began to walk. My posture radiated absolute, unapologetic authority. Beside me, Liam moved in perfect synchronization, his imposing 6'2" frame acting as an impenetrable wall of silent masculine power. We did not walk like a couple seeking forgiveness. We strode down the center aisle like royalty inspecting a newly conquered territory. As we moved deeper into the ballroom, the aggressive whispering of the crowd began to falter rapidly, transforming into murmurs of profound confusion. The guests were looking for signs of distress for cheap clothing or nervous, erratic behavior. Instead, they were hit by the sheer, overwhelming force of our quiet luxury. They recognized the immaculate tailored cut of Liam's charcoal tuxedo. They noticed the effortless, commanding way I carried myself, a demeanor that cannot be faked or bought on credit. Next to the timeless, grounded elegance, we projected Cynthia's flashy, sequined red designer gown suddenly looked incredibly cheap, loud, and desperately tacky. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the stage. Richard was standing slightly behind his wife, his chest puffed out, trying to project strength despite the fact that I knew he was weeks away from total financial ruin. Cynthia stood at the edge of the stage, leaning forward eagerly. Her eyes dropped to my hands, furiously searching for the rectangular slip of paper she felt she was owed. She was fully expecting me to walk up the carpeted stairs, hand over a $1 million check to save her foreclosed mansion, and publicly apologize for daring to defy her. We stopped walking exactly 10 feet from the edge of the stage. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like it could shatter the crystal chandeliers above us. Cynthia lowered the microphone slightly, her wicked smile faltering just a fraction as she realized I was not reaching into my clutch for a checkbook. I was simply staring at her with a look of profound, icy pity. The kind of pity one reserves for a rabid dog that does not yet realize it has been backed into a corner. "Well?" Cynthia hissed, forgetting to use the microphone, her voice carrying a sharp, desperate edge that only the front row could hear. "We are waiting, Paige. Show everyone you are ready to heal this family." I did not answer her. Instead, I turned my back to the stage, entirely dismissing her authority in front of the most powerful people in the city. I looked back down the long center aisle toward the gilded double doors and raised my right hand, giving a simple, sharp signal. The heavy wooden doors immediately swung open again. The tense, suffocating silence of the banquet hall was suddenly broken by the bright, unmistakable sound of genuine, innocent laughter. A woman in a crisp, professional uniform stepped through the entryway, gently holding the hands of two small children. They were my absolute world. Leo and Maya, my beautiful 6-year-old twins, whom Liam and I had adopted exactly 2 years prior. They both happened to have Down syndrome, and they possessed a radiant, unfiltered joy that completely eclipsed the dark, toxic energy of the ballroom. Leo was dressed in a tiny tailored suit that matched Liam's perfectly, while Maya wore a beautiful navy blue silk dress that mirrored my own. The moment their bright eyes scanned the massive room and locked onto us, their faces lit up with pure, unadulterated excitement. They let go of their nanny's hands and broke into a fast, clumsy run straight down the center aisle. "Mommy, Daddy!" they cheered in unison, their voices echoing through the cavernous space, entirely oblivious to the hundreds of stunned socialites staring at them. The crowd parted instinctively, completely disarmed by the sudden influx of pure, joyful energy. Leo crashed directly into Liam's legs, and my formidable, intimidating husband immediately dropped to one knee, a massive, genuine smile breaking across his face as he scooped the boy into his arms. Maya ran straight to me, throwing her arms tightly around my waist, burying her face in the expensive cashmere of my blazer. I leaned down, kissing the top of her head, wrapping my arms around her small shoulders, feeling a profound surge of protective love that Cynthia had never in her entire life been capable of providing. I stood back up, holding Maya's small hand securely in mine. I turned slowly back to face the stage where Cynthia and Richard were standing, frozen in absolute, uncomprehending shock. They knew nothing about my children. They had spent the last decade entirely consumed by their own greed, completely ignoring the beautiful, authentic life I had built from the ashes of their neglect. I did not need a microphone to make my voice carry. The room was so deadly quiet that my words rang out with crystalline clarity, slicing through the heavy air. "You speak a great deal about family, Cynthia," I said, my voice steady, carrying no anger, only the calm, devastating weight of the absolute truth. You speak of healing of legacy and of unconditional love, but those are concepts you have never actually understood because you view people solely as transactions. You demanded a check tonight to buy the title of mother. I looked down at Maya, who was smiling happily at the glittering chandeliers, and then at Leo, who was securely wrapped in Liam's strong arms. I looked out at the sea of wealthy investors, ensuring every single person in the room heard my next words. I will not be paying that invoice. I announced, my voice echoing with finality. I do not need to buy a place in a fabricated, fraudulent kingdom. I brought my real family here tonight, not to beg for forgiveness, but to show you exactly what genuine, unconditional love looks like, and to show this entire room that the desperate, toxic charade you are running on this stage is officially over. The echo of my words had barely settled into the heavy velvet drapes of the ballroom, when the illusion of Richard and Cynthia's perfect life finally violently shattered. Up on the brilliantly lit stage, Cynthia stood frozen, the microphone trembling in her manicured hand, her mouth a tight line of shock. But it was Richard, who completely lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. The meticulously tailored tuxedo he wore suddenly seemed too tight to contain the explosive, unadulterated fury radiating from his flushed skin. He did not politely excuse himself or attempt to salvage the extravagant charity narrative they had spun for their affluent guests. Instead, he stomped toward the edge of the stage, his heavy footsteps thudding loudly against the hollow wooden risers. He descended the carpeted stairs with aggressive, jerky movements, his face a terrifying shade of deep mottled purple. The vein pulsing visibly at his temple looked ready to burst. He marched straight down the center aisle, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides, entirely ignoring the hundreds of elite socialites and prominent investors seated at the lavishly decorated tables around him. Liam immediately shifted his weight, his tall, imposing frame stepping seamlessly between Richard and my children. He did not say a word, but the cold, absolute warning in Liam's dark eyes was unmistakable. I knelt smoothly, wrapping one arm protectively around Maya, and gently pulling Leo close to my side, shielding their innocent joy from the toxic storm hurtling toward us. Richard stopped just inches from Liam, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with arrogant rage. He tried to look past my husband, his eyes landing on my beautiful, smiling twins. The expression that twisted Richard's face was not just anger, it was pure, visceral revulsion. His upper lip curled in a grotesque sneer as he looked at my son and daughter, entirely offended by their very existence. He had spent his entire life valuing people solely by their pristine aesthetic and financial utility, and the sight of children who did not fit his rigid, superficial mold pushed him over the edge. He leaned around Liam's broad shoulder, his eyes wild and utterly devoid of humanity, fixing a venomous glare on me. Stripped of his leverage and his fake public persona, his true vile nature spilled out unfiltered. "You look like absolute trash," Richard hissed, his face twisted in a mask of pure disgust. "And now you drag defective kids in here into this room, you bring them to our anniversary." He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger toward Leo, who buried his face into my shoulder, frightened by the sudden, ugly hostility radiating from the large man. "Keep them away from Madison," Richard snarled, his voice vibrating with malicious contempt. "Do you hear me? Keep those things far away from my daughter. They will completely ruin her perfect image." Richard had intended his venomous outburst to be a harsh, intimidating whisper, a private lash meant only to cut me down and force me into submission. But his rage had completely blinded him to his surroundings. He had lost control of his volume. In the cavernous vaulted ballroom, where the string quartet had abruptly ceased playing, and the entire crowd was already holding its collective breath, his words did not remain private. His vile, hateful command carried across the silent room with razor-sharp clarity. The sound bounced off the crystal chandeliers and traveled across the pristine white tablecloths. It cut through the scent of imported truffles and vintage champagne, reaching the ears of every single high society guest, every venture capitalist, and every influential politician seated in the hall. The turning tide was instantaneous and absolute. A wave of profound, appalled silence crashed over the ballroom. The elite crowd, accustomed to polite deceptions and refined manners, was entirely paralyzed by the sheer, unvarnished cruelty they had just witnessed. At a nearby table, a wealthy dowager audibly gasped a delicate crystal champagne flute, slipping from her hand to shatter against the polished marble floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass was the only noise in the otherwise dead room. Next to her, a prominent investment banker lowered his fork, his expression shifting from polite confusion to utter profound disgust. These were the very people Richard and Cynthia had invited to swindle. These were the marks they had buttered up with expensive caviar and tragic tales of a misunderstood healing family. They had been sold a narrative of a generous, loving couple seeking funds for their brilliant daughter's medical startup. In a matter of seconds, Richard had violently ripped the curtain down on their own scam. No amount of gold-embossed stationery or five-star catering could mask the ugly, rotting core of the man standing in the center aisle. The investors were looking at a monster, and the realization rippled through the room like a cold winter draft. Up on the stage, Cynthia finally seemed to realize the catastrophic magnitude of what her husband had just done. She dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, shrieking blast of feedback that made several guests wince, but Richard was too consumed by his own hateful momentum to notice the sudden freezing shift in the room's atmosphere. He remained glaring at me, his chest puffed out, waiting for me to cower, waiting for the shame he projected to break me. I simply held my children closer, my gaze steady and utterly unbothered, letting the heavy, judgmental silence of hundreds of powerful people press down on his shoulders. Then movement at the very front of the room shattered the frozen tableau. At the prime head table, situated directly below the stage and reserved for the most elite high-net-worth individuals, a figure rose abruptly. It was an elderly, distinguished gentleman with a shock of silver hair and a sharply tailored conservative black suit. He was the primary VIP guest of the evening, a legendary billionaire investor whom Richard had been desperately aggressively trying to corner and swindle since the cocktail hour began. He was the ultimate mark, the golden ticket to saving their foreclosed mansion. The elderly billionaire did not call out to the room or ask for an explanation. His face was a mask of cold, patrician fury. He pushed his heavy, velvet-upholstered chair back with a loud, scraping thud that drew every eye in the ballroom. Without a single word, the VIP guest stepped away from his half-eaten plate of caviar, turned his back on the stage, and began walking directly down the center aisle, moving with terrifying, deliberate purpose straight toward Richard. The heavy, measured footsteps of the elderly billionaire echoed against the polished marble floor, cutting through the suffocating silence of the ballroom. This was Arthur Sterling, the undisputed kingmaker of the local financial district, a man whose mere presence at an event could dictate the rise or fall of corporate empires. Richard's purple rage-contorted face rapidly morphed into a mask of desperate, obsequious relief. He mistakenly believed that Sterling, a man of notoriously high standards, was stepping in to enforce decorum. Richard assumed the billionaire was coming to demand the removal of the unruly, disruptive elements, meaning me, my children, and my fiercely protective husband. Smoothing his lapels and forcing a sickeningly eager smile, Richard stepped forward, extending his trembling, sweaty hand to greet his supposed savior. The VIP investor completely ignored Richard's outstretched hand. Instead, he walked past him and bowed respectfully to Liam. "Mr. Liam, it is a profound honor. And Lady Page, I cannot thank your medical foundation enough for the recent grant." Sterling's rich baritone voice carried effortlessly through the quiet hall. "The pediatric wing at the downtown children's hospital would not have been completed without your extraordinary generosity. Your commitment to healthcare is a beacon for us all, and it is a privilege to finally meet you in person." If Richard had been struck by a physical blow, he could not have looked more paralyzed. His outstretched hand fell limply to his side, striking his thigh with a dull thud. The color drained completely from his face, leaving behind a sickly ashen gray. He stared at Sterling, then at Liam, and finally at me, his eyes wide and vacant as his brain violently rejected the reality playing out in front of him. The words Lady Page and Medical Foundation hovered in the air, completely obliterating the pathetic narrative he and my mother had spent years peddling to their country club friends. Beside me, Jamal adjusted his grip on the thick manila envelope containing the absolute proof of Richard's bankruptcy, a cold, satisfied smile playing on his lips. Up on the brightly lit stage, the illusion finally broke. Cynthia had been clutching a crystal champagne flute, her knuckles white with tension, as she watched the exchange from above. The absolute certainty of her superiority, the deeply ingrained belief that I was nothing more than a desperate warehouse worker, and Liam a hired thug, shattered in a single instant. The sheer cognitive dissonance was too much for her fragile narcissistic mind to process. Her fingers went slack. Cynthia, watching from the stage, dropped her crystal champagne flute. It plummeted to the polished wooden floor, shattering loudly across the stage floor. The sharp, explosive crash echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. Shards of expensive glass exploded outward, scattering across the very spot where she had just been delivering her fabricated tale of a wayward daughter. The realization hit them like a freight train. The bespoke clothing, the unshakable confidence, the profound respect from the city's most powerful man, it all suddenly made terrifying sense. Paige isn't a struggling warehouse worker, and Liam isn't a bodyguard. We were the very titans of industry they had been pretending to be. The sound of the breaking glass snapped the rest of the room out of its trance. The murmuring began again, but this time it was not aimed at me. The elite crowd, the venture capitalists, the politicians and the socialites, turned their sharp, predatory gazes toward the stage. They were a crowd that smelled blood in the water. They were calculating the implications of Arthur Sterling's bow. They were reevaluating every word Cynthia and Richard had spoken that evening. The realization was dawning collectively across hundreds of minds. The hosts of this lavish anniversary banquet had not just lied, they had actively tried to humiliate individuals vastly more powerful than themselves, and they had exposed their own grotesque cruelty in the process. Cynthia looked down at the broken glass, her heavily contoured face trembling. Her bright red designer gown suddenly looked less like a symbol of wealth and more like a cheap, desperate costume. She looked at Richard, who was still frozen in the center aisle, his mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. They were entirely trapped in their own meticulously constructed snare. Sterling, sensing the massive shift in the room's energy, turned his back to us and faced the bewildered crowd. He adjusted his pristine cuffs, his demeanor radiating quiet, absolute authority. He decided to entirely dismantle whatever remained of Richard and Cynthia's fake empire, ensuring that their social execution was thorough and public. He projected his voice perfectly, ensuring that no one, not even the waitstaff standing in the far corners of the hall, would miss a single syllable of the truth. The VIP investor turned to the crowd and announced, "For those who don't know, Liam's hedge fund practically owns half the commercial real estate in this city, and Page's tech firm went public last week for $2 billion. The collective gasp that followed was deafening. The sheer magnitude of those numbers crashed over the audience, permanently cementing our status and finalizing my parents' utter destruction. The sheer magnitude of Arthur Sterling's words acted like a gravitational event, completely warping the reality of the room. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the sudden crushing weight of billion-dollar revelations. For an agonizing stretch of seconds, no one moved. Richard's mottled purple face instantly drained to a sickly translucent white. The vein pulsing in his temple flattened. His mouth, previously twisted in a snarl of disgust, fell slack. Cynthia, still standing near the shattered remains of her champagne flute, looked as though she had been struck by lightning. Her heavily painted eyes darted from Arthur Sterling to Liam and finally frantically to me. The mental calculus she was performing was visible in the frantic twitching of her expression. The daughter she had written off as a pathetic warehouse worker, the woman she had invited here to publicly execute for a measly $1 million, was a billionaire. I was not a charity case, I was a sovereign wealth fund. Panic entirely consumed them. The toxic, tyrannical masks they had worn for my entire life dissolved into expressions of grotesque, groveling desperation. Cynthia moved first. She scrambled down the carpeted stairs of the stage, stumbling slightly over the heavy sequined hem of her aggressively red gown. She threw her arms out wide, manifesting a frantic, tearful smile that was utterly terrifying in its falsehood. "Paige! Oh, my brilliant, beautiful Paige!" Cynthia cried out, her voice shrill and desperate, projecting for the benefit of the watching socialites. "We knew it. We always knew you had it in you." Richard was right behind her, his earlier violent disgust completely vanishing, replaced by a sickening, fawning eagerness. He wiped his sweating palms on his trousers and bounded forward. "Darling, please, you have to understand." Richard laughed, a hollow, reedy sound that scraped against the eardrums. "It was tough love we had to push you. We saw that fierce entrepreneurial spirit burning inside you, and we knew you just needed the right motivation to build your empire. We are so incredibly proud of you. Come here, let your parents give you a proper embrace." They rushed forward, hands outstretched, eager to physically claim me to attach their sinking, fraudulent brand to my verified astronomical success. They never made it past the first step. Liam stepped forward. He moved with the sudden, terrifying speed of an apex predator, placing his broad shoulders squarely between my parents and me. He did not raise his hands. He did not need to. The absolute glacial fury radiating from his dark eyes hit Richard and Cynthia like a physical wall of ice. The temperature in their immediate vicinity seemed to drop 20 degrees. They skidded to a halt, physically repelled by the lethal warning written across my husband's face. "You will not take another step toward my wife, and you will not look at my children," Liam stated. His voice was low, carrying a quiet, resonant authority that commanded absolute obedience. "You lost the right to use those titles the moment you abandoned her." Richard, sweating profusely, tried to maintain his fake jovial posture. "Now, Liam, let us not be hasty. We are all family here. Families have misunderstandings. With your resources and my local connections, we could form an unstoppable partnership. Think of the synergy." Liam tilted his head slightly, studying Richard like a biologist examining a particularly repulsive parasite. "We are already partners, Richard," Liam said, his tone razor-sharp, "though you were entirely unaware of the arrangement." The fake smile on Richard's face twitched. "I am sorry, what do you mean?" "My hedge fund specializes in acquiring distressed toxic assets." Liam explained, his voice projecting just enough for the front row of elite investors to hear every damning syllable. "Over the past 6 months, we have been quietly purchasing your debt. All of it. We hold the primary liens on your residential properties. We acquired the defaulted loans on your manufacturing facilities. We even bought out the heavily leveraged lines of credit you fraudulently secured against the country club's pension fund." A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. A prominent board member of the local country club stood up, his face turning red with shock. Liam did not stop. He began to verbally dismantle Richard, laying out a forensic execution with brutal surgical precision. "During the acquisition process, my auditors uncovered exactly how you have been keeping up appearances. We found the offshore shell companies you used to embezzle funds from your own investors. We found the massive gaping holes in your operating capital. We found the wire fraud. We found the incredibly clumsy attempts to misappropriate corporate funds to pay for your other daughter's lavish lifestyle." Cynthia let out a high-pitched whimper, stepping back as if Liam were throwing actual daggers. "And the most pathetic discovery of all," Liam continued, his voice dripping with absolute contempt, "were the forged medical school receipts. Madison is not enrolled in any medical program. She dropped out 3 years ago. The startup you are pitching tonight is a complete fabrication designed to pay off loan sharks and cover her severe gambling debts. You are entirely bankrupt, Richard, morally, socially, and financially." The grand ballroom devolved into absolute chaos. Investors who had been considering writing massive checks to Richard suddenly stood up, shouting demands for their previous investments. Women in expensive gowns clutched their pearls, whispering frantically to their husbands. The illusion of the elite untouchable family was dead, replaced by the ugly reality of desperate common criminals. Richard stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked completely hollowed out, a deflated balloon of a man realizing that every lie he had ever told had just been exposed to the city's most powerful people. Cynthia covered her face with her hands, finally producing genuine tears of absolute profound humiliation. Through the pandemonium, Jamal moved. He stepped out from behind us, his posture immaculate, the thick manila envelope tucked securely under his arm. He walked past the shivering broken figures of my parents without affording them a single glance. He climbed the carpeted stairs with calm, measured steps, ignoring the shards of broken crystal scattered across the wood. He walked directly to the center of the stage and picked up the microphone Cynthia had dropped. The feedback whined briefly before Jamal adjusted the volume. He reached over to the podium and picked up a heavy crystal water glass. With a silver pen from his breast pocket, he tapped the glass 3 times. The sharp, clear chiming cut through the uproar of the ballroom. The shouting subsided. The angry investors and shocked socialites turned their attention to the sharp-suited forensic auditor standing under the spotlights. Jamal stood tall, radiating the cold, precise authority of a man who dealt exclusively in hard facts and undeniable evidence. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Richard, who was now trembling at the base of the stage. "Since we are celebrating family and new ventures tonight," Jamal announced, his voice smooth, professional, and carrying the lethal weight of an incoming storm, "I think we should take a close look at the finances funding this party." Jamal unclasped the heavy manila envelope with a crisp, definitive snap. He pulled out a thick stack of embossed receipts and held them up to the blinding stage lights. "This breathtaking venue," Jamal began, his voice devoid of anger but packed with lethal precision. "The imported beluga caviar you have all been enjoying, the towering arrangements of white orchids on your tables, and the vintage champagne flowing so freely. I hope you have savored every drop because Richard and Cynthia did not pay for a single cent of it. I did." A low murmur of shock swept through the seated guests. Jamal paced slowly across the stage, owning the space with the absolute certainty of a man armed with empirical data. "My name is Jamal." He continued, making eye contact with the prominent investors seated in the front rows. "I am a top-tier forensic auditor, and until very recently, I was married to Madison, the so-called brilliant medical student this entire masquerade was designed to fund. Over the past 72 hours, I have conducted a comprehensive audit of my own marriage and the extended family's accounts. What I found was not a struggling medical venture. I found a massive coordinated theft." Jamal paused, raising his left hand in a subtle gesture toward the back of the room. The head waiter, a man Jamal had approached hours before the banquet with a very generous, legitimate cash tip, caught the signal. On command, dozens of waitstaff in crisp white gloves emerged from the service doors. But instead of carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, they carried neat, heavily stapled dossiers. They moved swiftly through the ballroom, distributing the thick packets directly to the venture capitalists, the politicians, the country club board members, and finally to the elderly billionaire Arthur Sterling. "Please open them," Jamal instructed, his tone echoing the authority of a professor addressing a classroom. "I believe in transparency, especially when millions of dollars are at stake. I have provided you all with a streamlined version of my forensic audit. You will find it thoroughly indexed and cross-referenced." The collective rustle of hundreds of pages turning filled the cavernous hall. High society titans adjusted their reading glasses, their expressions shifting rapidly from polite bewilderment to unadulterated horror. "If you turn to page 3, Jamal guided them, his eyes locked on the front table, "you will see the exact credit card statements and unauthorized wire transfers Madison used to fund tonight's anniversary gala. She stole my identity, maxed out lines of credit in my name, and funneled the money into shell accounts managed by her mother. But the banquet is merely a drop in the ocean." Jamal stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at Richard and Cynthia, who were now clinging to each other in paralyzed terror. "Page 7 details the true nature of Madison's medical career," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "There are no medical school tuition receipts. There are no lab fees. Madison dropped out of her program 3 years ago. The hundreds of thousands of dollars I provided for her education, the funds her parents have been begging you to invest in tonight, went directly to offshore high-stakes gambling accounts. She is a pathological gambling addict who has decimated her own credit and was actively working to decimate mine. Gasps erupted from the tables. Several investors angrily slammed the dossiers down, glaring at Richard. But Jamal was not finished. He turned the page of his own copy, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. "And finally, page 12, Jamal said, the clinical detachment in his voice finally giving way to a raw, undeniable edge. "This is where the audit becomes deeply personal. You will see highlighted recurring wire transfers categorized as medical consultation fees. These transfers occurred weekly for the past 4 years. They were not going to a tutor or a professor. They were going to a man named Trent. While I was working 80-hour weeks to support my wife's supposed medical dreams, she was funneling my hard-earned salary to her secret lover." The ballroom erupted. The silence that had previously choked the room was obliterated by shouts of outrage and disgust. Investors began pushing their chairs back openly, confronting Richard and demanding immediate restitution. The glittering high society event had been transformed into a crime scene, and Jamal stood at the center of it, the orchestrator of their absolute ruin. From the shadowed wings of the stage, a horrific, piercing shriek tore through the chaos. Madison burst into the spotlight. She had been hiding backstage waiting for her grand, tragic entrance to solicit funds, but the reality of her total exposure had completely broken her facade. She was dressed in an extravagant pearl-beaded white gown that looked absurdly bridal, her face contorted into a mask of feral panic. Her carefully styled hair whipped around her shoulders as she realized the city's most elite circle was currently reading the itemized receipts of her infidelity and fraud. "Give them back!" Madison screamed, a guttural, banshee-like wail that made several guests physically recoil. "You're lying! He's lying!" She lunged across the wooden stage, her manicured hands hooked like claws, aiming directly for the master copy of the audit in Jamal's hand. She was completely unhinged, driven by the desperate animalistic need to destroy the physical evidence of her crimes. Jamal did not flinch. He had anticipated her erratic behavior. With the fluid, effortless grace of a man who was entirely in control of his environment, he simply sidestepped her reckless charge. Madison stumbled past him, her heavy beaded gown catching on the microphone wire, sending her crashing to her knees against the hard wooden floorboards. Jamal looked down at his estranged wife, his expression stripped of any lingering affection or pity. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored gray suit. "You want paper so bad, Madison?" Jamal asked, his voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing. He pulled out a separate, thick, legally bound document, the crisp white pages secured with a heavy blue legal backing. He held it out, dropping it directly onto the stage floor in front of her trembling hands. "Here." The thick, blue-backed legal document did not just fall to the floor. Jamal stepped forward and slapped the heavy packet directly against the center of Madison's chest. The sharp smack of the paper against the intricate pearl beading of her gown echoed through the cavernous ballroom. Stamped in bold, unforgiving black ink across the front page were the words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." Jamal had not merely brought financial receipts to this opulent anniversary gala. He had brought the legal, instantaneous termination of their union. Madison gasped as the heavy packet struck her, her hands flying up too late to catch it as it slid down her dress and landed heavily at her feet. The frantic clawing energy that had propelled her across the stage evaporated in a fraction of a second. The reality of her situation, that her endless well of stolen money was permanently capped and her public reputation was completely annihilated, finally broke through her profound narcissism. She collapsed heavily to her knees, the extravagant fabric of her fake bridal gown pooling awkwardly around her on the polished floorboards. She looked less like a high society princess and more like a discarded broken prop. She began to weep, letting out a series of ugly guttural sobs, burying her face in her trembling hands. She expected sympathy. She desperately waited for someone to rush forward to comfort her and to cast Jamal as the cruel villain for embarrassing her so publicly. But as her wailing echoed through the room, the response was a wall of profound, suffocating disgust. The elite venture capitalists and refined socialites did not murmur in pity. They glared. Women who had just an hour ago complimented Madison's radiant complexion now sneered, turning their shoulders away in absolute revulsion. The prominent investment banker, seated in the front row, actually picked up his pristine white linen napkin and wiped his hands as if the mere act of breathing the same air as her had soiled him. The crowd was looking at a parasite thoroughly exposed under the harsh fluorescent spotlights, and the collective disdain was a physical weight pressing down on the stage. Jamal stepped away from the weeping woman, treating her as nothing more than an unpleasant obstacle he had successfully navigated. He adjusted his tailored jacket, his posture straightening as he looked out over the sea of furious, disillusioned elites, and finally down at Richard and Cynthia, who were still cowering near the front table. This family built an entire empire on the illusion of superiority. Jamal stated, his voice resonating with absolute clarity through the premium sound system. You demanded absolute loyalty while offering nothing but deceit. You demanded respect while operating with the morals of back-alley grifters. You thought you could simply bury the truth beneath imported caviar and rented crystal chandeliers. He paused, his dark eyes locking onto Richard's sweating, terrified face. But the truth is relentless. It does not care about your country club memberships or your fabricated philanthropic public image. I choose the truth. Jamal then shifted his gaze, scanning the silent room until his eyes met mine. He offered a small, deeply respectful nod, a gesture of profound solidarity that bridged the gap between our respective traumas. From today onward, Jamal declared, his voice carrying the heavy finality of a judge delivering a verdict. Paige is the only person from this rotting, corrupt family that I respect. She is the only one who survived your profound toxicity without becoming infected by it. You tried to bury her just like you tried to bleed me dry. But all you did was show everyone in this room exactly who you really are. With that final damning statement, Jamal turned his back on his soon-to-be ex-wife. He did not spare Madison a single backward glance as she continued to sob on the floorboards. He descended the carpeted stage stairs with the calm, measured stride of a man who had just excised a lethal tumor from his life. He bypassed the empty, staring faces of the remaining guests and stepped directly into our circle, taking his place firmly beside Liam and me. The physical line was drawn, the three of us standing united, a fortress of truth and hard-earned success against the crumbling ruins of my parents' deceit. The moment Jamal stepped off the stage, the paralysis that had gripped the elite crowd finally shattered. It did not happen with a chaotic, uncoordinated scramble, but with a terrifying, synchronized precision. At the VIP tables near the front, heavy wooden chairs were pushed back simultaneously. The loud screech of the furniture against the polished marble floor sounded like the unsheathing of 100 swords. These were not ordinary guests, easily swayed by apologies. These were ruthless hedge fund managers, political power brokers, and venture capitalists who did not tolerate being made fools of. Arthur Sterling, the billionaire kingmaker who had initiated the reckoning, stood at the forefront. Without a single word spoken between them, the most powerful investors in the city formed a unified, aggressive front. They marched towards the head table where Richard was still standing, his knees visibly shaking beneath his expensive tuxedo. The group moved with a grim, predatory purpose, their tailored suits and designer gowns rustling ominously. The string quartet had long since packed up their instruments, fleeing the impending disaster, leaving only the heavy rhythmic thud of angry, powerful footsteps marching down the center aisle. Richard backed up, his hands raised defensively, but there was nowhere to go. His back hit the hard edge of the stage. Cynthia pressed herself against the velvet drapery, trying desperately to blend into the shadows, her hands clutching her throat. Sterling reached the table first, his silver hair catching the chandelier light. He slammed his hand flat against the white tablecloth, rattling the fine china and knocking over a half-empty glass of water. The checks, Richard Sterling demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute obedience. Every single initial investment check you collected during the cocktail hour for this fraudulent clinic, you will return them right now. Richard looked around wildly, his eyes wide with a trapped animal panic. He was surrounded by a wall of furious billionaires, and the absolute end had finally arrived. The suffocating pressure of Arthur Sterling and the furious wall of investors caused Richard to physically crumple. He patted the pockets of his expensive tuxedo with violent, jerky movements, his hands shaking so violently he could barely operate the buttons of his jacket. The initial investment checks were tucked away in a leather folio on the table, but handing them over meant surrendering the very last drops of oxygen, keeping his fraudulent lifestyle alive. Sterling did not move, his outstretched hand steady and uncompromising. The silence from the surrounding billionaires was a deafening roar of impending legal and financial ruin. Richard realized in that agonizing split second that there was no charming his way out of this trap. There were no more lies to spin, no more fake medical startups to pitch, and no more local connections to leverage. His entire existence had been exposed as a hollow, rotting shell. He began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as the tailored shirt clung to his sweat-drenched skin. He looked at the faces of the investors, finding only absolute disgust. He looked toward the stage where Cynthia was frozen in horror, and Madison was still sobbing over her divorce papers. Finally, his wild, bloodshot eyes darted across the room and locked onto me. I stood flanked by Liam and Jamal, a united front of immense verified power. In Richard's broken, panicked mind, he saw the only remaining life raft in an ocean of his own destructive making. I possessed the billions required to make Sterling step away. I had the power to command Liam to dissolve the acquired debt. I was the golden ticket he had spent his entire life searching for, and he had spent decades treating me like dirt. All sense of decorum, pride, and high society etiquette instantly evaporated. Richard pushed blindly past a stunned venture capitalist, stumbling over his own feet as he propelled himself down the center aisle. He closed the distance between us with the frantic, stumbling gait of a drowning man. Before Liam could intercept him, Richard threw his entire body forward. He crashed to his knees on the hard marble floor directly at my feet. The loud, sharp crack of his kneecaps hitting the stone echoed clearly through the silent hall. He did not care who was watching. He reached out with trembling, clammy hands and grabbed a handful of the luxurious silk hem of my dress, clutching it as if it were a holy relic. "Paige, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical sob. Saliva and sweat dripped from his chin, completely ruining his meticulously groomed appearance. "Please, you have to help us. You have to save me." Liam immediately shifted his weight, his jaw clenching as he prepared to physically detach the weeping man from my clothing. I raised a single hand, gently touching Liam's arm to hold him back. I wanted to witness this. I wanted to let Richard drain the very last ounce of his manufactured dignity in front of the entire city. "We are blood, Paige!" Richard wailed, his knuckles turning white as he gripped my dress. Tears streamed down his purple, blotchy cheeks, mixing with the sweat. "You are my daughter. Family is everything. I know I made mistakes. I know I was hard on you, but it was only to make you strong. You have to pay them. Just write the check. Tell your husband to forgive the loans. We will lose the house. We will be homeless, Paige. I am begging you in the name of God, look into your heart and show your family some mercy." Behind him, Cynthia had finally found the strength to move. She crawled forward, dropping to her knees a few feet away, her hands clasped together in a pathetic mimicry of prayer, weeping loudly and nodding along to Richard's frantic pleading. They were a pathetic spectacle, entirely stripped of their arrogance, reduced to groveling on the floor for the mercy of the child they had relentlessly tormented. I looked down at the man clutching my dress. For years I had feared his disapproval. I had spent my childhood terrified of his booming voice, his harsh critiques, and his absolute dismissal of my worth. I searched myself for a shred of sympathy, for a lingering spark of familial obligation. There was nothing. My gaze was completely devoid of emotion. I did not feel hatred or vindictiveness or even pity. I simply felt an overwhelming, freezing apathy. The man weeping at my feet was a stranger, a toxic parasite that had finally been severed from its host. "Blood means absolutely nothing when it is entirely poisoned, Richard." I stated, my voice ringing out cold, flat, and perfectly steady. "And you do not get to invoke God to save you from the consequences of your own greed." I looked down at his white-knuckled grip on my clothing. With a swift, fluid motion, I yanked the silk fabric straight out of his sweaty hands. He fell forward slightly, his palms slapping against the marble floor as he lost his balance. I did not step back. I simply raised my right hand into the air, holding it high enough for everyone in the cavernous ballroom to see. I snapped my fingers. The sharp, crisp sound cracked like a whip. Instantly, the massive, heavy mahogany double doors at the very back of the banquet hall swung open. The heavy brass latches clacked loudly, drawing the eyes of every single person away from the pathetic display on the floor and toward the entrance. A synchronized, rhythmic thudding of heavy footsteps began to echo into the ballroom. Through the doorway marched a phalanx of 10 individuals. They moved in perfect, relentless unison. They did not wear evening gowns or tuxedos. They wore impeccably tailored charcoal gray business suits. They carried briefcases and thick leather folios. This was my elite corporate legal team, a group of the most ruthless, efficient litigators on the Eastern Seaboard, and they had not come to attend a party. Their professional, predatory demeanor stood in stark contrast to the chaotic wreckage of Richard's anniversary gala. The crowd of socialites and investors parted instinctively, creating a wide path as the attorneys marched straight down the center aisle. They did not pause to acknowledge the whispers or the stares. They moved with the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche. Richard turned his head, still kneeling on the floor, his tear-streaked face registering a brand new level of absolute horror as the lawyers approached. He knew instinctively that these people were not bringing salvation. They were not carrying settlement offers, negotiation terms, or extension agreements. The lead attorney, a tall, imposing woman with sharp features and a completely unreadable expression, stopped directly in front of Richard. She opened her leather folio and pulled out a stack of heavy watermarked documents. These were not threats or warnings. They were finalized court-approved foreclosure and asset seizure notices. The final nail had been driven into the coffin, and the eviction was scheduled for tonight. The lead attorney did not offer a polite greeting. She did not lower her voice to preserve Richard's shredded dignity, nor did she acknowledge his pathetic weeping form on the floor. She held the top document with perfect mechanical poise and began to read aloud. Her voice rang out crisp and sharp, echoing across the silent, captivated ballroom like a death knell. Pursuant to the emergency orders granted by the Federal District Court, the attorney recited every syllable landing like a hammer strike. We are executing the immediate seizure of all assets tied to the fraudulent corporate entities operated under your name. Richard let out a pathetic, suffocated wheeze, his hands still planted flat against the cold marble floor. The attorney did not pause to allow him to catch his breath. Effective as of 5 o'clock this afternoon, all offshore accounts traced to your shell corporations have been frozen and seized. The fleet of luxury vehicles currently registered to your estate, including the 2 Bentleys and the imported sports car, have been officially impounded by our recovery agents. She flipped a page, the crisp rustle amplifying the absolute dread suffocating my parents. Furthermore, the primary residence has been foreclosed upon. The locks have already been changed by our on-site security team. You are entirely barred from entering the premises. Any personal belongings not procured with embezzled funds will be shipped to a secondary location provided you can secure one. The attorney paused, adjusting her glasses slightly before delivering the ultimate societal death blow. And finally, due to the severe nature of the financial crimes and the blatant misappropriation of local pension funds, the Board of Directors has permanently and irrevocably revoked your memberships to the prestigious Oak Ridge Country Club and all affiliated high society organizations. You are completely, officially exiled from this community. Richard collapsed entirely, his forehead pressing against the hard floor as he wept in loud, ugly, uninhibited gasps. But it was Cynthia whose reaction shifted the atmosphere from a cold corporate execution to a scene of visceral horror. She had remained pressed against the heavy velvet stage drapes, her mind frantically searching for a loophole, a wealthy uncle, a hidden account, or a socialite friend who might take pity. But the mention of the country club exile shattered the very last remnant of her sanity. That membership was her lifeblood, her identity, her entire reason for drawing breath. Without the club, without the mansion, without the cars, she was absolutely nothing. Cynthia's eyes, previously wide with terror, suddenly narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated venom. She pushed herself away from the drapes, her breathing ragged and heavy. She did not look at me. She did not look at Richard sobbing on the floor, or the wall of hostile billionaires standing just steps away. She turned her sights entirely onto the source of their immediate financial hemorrhage. She locked eyes with Madison, who was still kneeling on the stage, clutching her divorce papers and whining hysterically. The transition was instantaneous and terrifying. Cynthia stalked across the wooden floorboards, her high heels stomping with aggressive militaristic force. Madison looked up, her tear-streaked face, expecting maternal comfort. Cynthia did not offer comfort. She pulled her arm back and delivered a vicious, echoing slap directly across Madison's perfectly contoured cheek. The sharp crack of the impact was so loud it made several guests jump in their seats. Madison was thrown sideways by the force of the blow, landing hard on her hip, her eyes wide with absolute shock. "You useless, pathetic failure!" Cynthia shrieked, her voice stripped of its cultured, breathy elegance, revealing the raw, screeching harpy beneath. She stood over her golden child, her face contorted in absolute fury. "We gave you everything, we handed you the world on a silver platter. All you had to do was pretend to study, pretend to be a doctor and keep your mouth shut, but you could not even do that." Cynthia leaned down, pointing a shaking, rage-fueled finger inches from Madison's face. "You ruined it! You ruined our entire scheme. You squandered millions on your filthy gambling addiction and your disgusting affairs. You destroyed my life." Madison, holding her rapidly swelling red cheeks, stared at her mother in disbelief for a fraction of a second before her own toxic rage ignited. The golden child, taught her entire life that she was untouchable, violently rejected the blame. She scrambled to her feet, kicking the heavy train of her ridiculous white gown out of the way, and launched herself back at her mother. "Do not you dare blame me for this!" Madison screamed back, her voice matching her mother's shrill pitch. She shoved Cynthia hard in the chest, making the older woman stumble backward. "You spoiled me. You taught me to lie. You handed me credit cards and told me to buy whatever I wanted so you could show off to your stupid, superficial friends." Madison stepped forward, fully closing the distance, her face an ugly mask of hatred. "You never disciplined me. You never told me no. You literally built a fake clinic to cover up my mistakes because you were too obsessed with your own image to actually be a mother. This is your fault. You created me." The mother and daughter descended into a chaotic, shrieking brawl, right there under the brilliant chandeliers. Cynthia lunged forward, grabbing a handful of Madison's meticulously styled hair, yanking her head back. Madison retaliated by clawing wildly at Cynthia's expensive designer gown, tearing a massive strip of red silk right off the bodice. They slapped, shoved, and screamed vicious, deeply personal insults, tearing each other apart with the exact same ruthless cruelty they had aimed at me for my entire existence. The grand, cavernous ballroom remained utterly captivated. The wealthy guests, the venture capitalists, the powerful politicians, they all stood frozen in morbid fascination. No one stepped forward to intervene. No one called for security. The elite crowd watched in disgusted awe as the city's self-proclaimed perfect family cannibalized each other on a brilliantly lit stage, completely destroying whatever microscopic shreds of dignity they had left. The pristine white tablecloths and overturned crystal glasses served as a silent audience to their absolute degradation. I stood a few feet away, entirely separated from the carnage. The chaotic screaming washed over me without leaving a single mark. I felt no urge to stop them, no lingering shred of guilt, and absolutely no pity. I was completely, beautifully unbothered. The toxic grip they once held over my mind was entirely shattered, leaving behind a cold, serene clarity. I turned slightly away from the spectacle, placing myself firmly between the stage and my family. I gently placed one hand over Maya's eyes and the other over Leo's, shielding their innocent minds from the pathetic, rotting display of a family that had finally consumed itself. Madison shoved her mother with the frenzied, reckless strength of a cornered animal. Cynthia stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the thick, heavy fabric of her own ruined silk gown. She went down hard, crashing against the solid wooden base of the stage with a sharp gasp that knocked the wind entirely out of her lungs. Madison did not even pause to check on her. The disgraced golden child scrambled away on her hands and knees, weeping uncontrollably as she frantically tried to gather the scattered pages of the forensic audit and her divorce papers, hopelessly attempting to piece her shattered illusion back together. Cynthia lay crumpled on the floor, gasping for air and clutching her ribs. Her carefully sprayed hair hung in ragged clumps across her face. One of her expensive diamond earrings had been torn out during the scuffle, leaving a bright smear of red on her earlobe. As she forced herself to sit up, her frantic gaze swept over the devastated ballroom. She saw Richard, her husband, weeping like a pathetic child into his hands, while the icy corporate lawyers stood over him like executioners. She saw her daughter, the supposed medical genius, reduced to a blubbering, ruined mess, completely stripped of her future fortune and her wealthy husband. The horrifying, undeniable truth crashed down upon Cynthia with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. Madison was utterly useless. Richard was permanently destroyed. The country club, the sprawling mansion, the offshore accounts, the imported cars, all of it was gone. In a matter of hours, she would be physically locked out of the only life she deemed worth living. She would be penniless, publicly disgraced, and utterly alone. Then her manic, darting eyes found me. I was standing tall, immaculate, and entirely secure. My husband stood beside me, a pillar of quiet strength, keeping a protective hold on our beautiful children. The corporate legal team that had just annihilated her husband worked for my company. The billionaire who had triggered this entire reckoning deeply respected me. I was the absolute epicenter of wealth and power in that room. Survival instinct raw and entirely devoid of pride hijacked Cynthia's brain. She did not attempt to stand up. Her trembling legs simply would not hold her weight. Instead, the elite matriarch of the Oak Ridge Country Club began to crawl. She pulled her body across the polished hardwood, her torn red silk dress soaking up spilled champagne and dragging heavily through the shattered remnants of crystal flutes. She ignored the sharp shards biting into her palms and her bare knees. She crawled right past the horrified, staring faces of the venture capitalists, panting heavily, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark rivers. She reached the toes of my shoes and threw her arms around my ankles. Her grip was desperately tight, her manicured fingernails digging fiercely into the fabric of my gown. "Paige, please," Cynthia wailed, staring up at me with a face entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, poised woman who had glided into the ballroom just hours ago. "Please, you have to help me, you have to save me." I looked down at her, my expression remaining completely unchanged. I slowly lowered my hands from Maya and Leo's eyes, gently guiding my children to take a step backward behind Liam, shielding them from the desperate, clutching woman sobbing on the floor. "You cannot abandon me," Cynthia cried out, her voice echoing wildly in the cavernous space. Real, terrified tears poured from her eyes, driven by the absolute certainty of her impending poverty. "I am your mother. You cannot leave me to starve. I gave birth to you. You owe me. A daughter cannot let the woman who brought her into this world sleep on the streets. Please, Paige, I am your mother." As her hysterical pleas rang out, a profound, heavy silence fell over the entire ballroom. The angry murmurs of the wealthy guests died instantly. The aggressive shuffling of the legal team ceased. Even Richard's pathetic weeping faded into a muffled, choked whimper. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the city held their collective breath, their eyes locked on the confrontation happening at the edge of the stage. The tension in the air was thick enough to suffocate a fire. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping, pathetic creature clinging to my ankles. My mind flashed back 16 years. The memory did not come with a surge of pain, but with absolute crystalline clarity. I saw the pouring rain. I felt the freezing wind biting through my thin, worn-out sweater. I heard the wet, heavy thud of black plastic garbage bags hitting the pavement as my meager belongings were unceremoniously tossed out the front door. I remembered being 14 years old, standing on the porch, shivering so violently my teeth cracked together. I remembered looking up at this exact same woman begging her through chattering teeth to just let me sleep on the hard floor of the hallway, promising I would not make a sound, promising I would be perfectly good. And I remembered her face. I remembered the cold, dead aristocratic disgust in her eyes as she looked down at her own child. I remembered the exact tilt of her chin, the slight curl of her upper lip, and the flat, unfeeling tone of her voice right before she slammed the heavy oak door in my face and locked the deadbolt. The silence in the ballroom stretched out heavy and expectant. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I gently but firmly pulled my ankles out of Cynthia's desperate grip, forcing her hands to drop back to the floor. I took half a step forward and then lowered myself, bending at the knees in a smooth, controlled motion until my face was entirely level with hers. I did not yell. I did not sneer. I simply adjusted my posture, aligning my spine and tilting my chin to perfectly mirror the exact haughty posture she had modeled for me on that freezing night 16 years ago. I let my eyes go completely flat, stripping away every ounce of warmth, pity, or recognition, leaving only a clinical, terrifying emptiness. I opened my mouth, perfectly capturing the exact cadence, the exact icy inflection, and the precise volume of her voice from my childhood. I don't have money to throw out the window for useless people. The words sliced through the silent ballroom like a surgical blade. I saw the instant the realization hit her. Cynthia's tear-filled eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror as she recognized her own words, her own cruel judgment being handed directly back to her. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, the devastating finality of the moment crushing her soul. I did not break eye contact. I maintained the perfect icy mirror of her past cruelty. "You're better suited for cleaning warehouses," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering finality. "Good luck." Without waiting for a response, I stood up smoothly. I brushed a microscopic, invisible speck of dust from the skirt of my gown, a gesture of profound and total dismissal. I turned on my heel and stepped back, rejoining my husband and my children. I did not look back as Cynthia realized she had truly lost everything, collapsing completely against the cold marble floor, her body convulsing with loud, hopeless, shattering sobs that echoed endlessly through the ruined gala. I turned my back on the pathetic, sobbing heap that was my mother. The sheer volume of Cynthia's wailing mingled with Madison's shrill screaming, and Richard's defeated whimpering should have been deafening. Yet to my ears, it had become nothing more than meaningless, distant white noise. The invisible, suffocating chains that had bound me to their toxic demands for my entire life shattered into dust, leaving me lighter than air. I did not feel an ounce of remorse. I did not feel a single twinge of hesitation. I felt only the absolute, undeniable surge of total liberation. Without breaking my stride or offering a single backward glance to the people who shared my DNA, I reached out my hand. Liam was there exactly as he always was, a solid wall of unwavering devotion. His large, warm fingers immediately intertwined with mine, his grip firm and grounding. He looked down at me, his eyes filled with a profound depth of pride and love that eclipsed the darkness of the room. We did not need to exchange words. The battle was over and the war was definitively won. With effortless grace, Liam bent down and scooped up our son Leo. He settled the boy comfortably against his broad chest, his strong arm wrapping protectively around the child's small back. Leo rested his head on Liam's shoulder, completely safe and entirely insulated from the venomous wreckage scattered across the stage behind us. I turned to gather our daughter, but Jamal was already stepping forward. The cold, calculating, ruthless energy of the forensic auditor that had just dismantled an empire vanished entirely. In its place stood a man who had reclaimed his own life and recognized the true value of loyalty. The hard lines of his jaw relaxed, and a genuine, deeply warm smile spread across his face. He stepped over the torn shreds of Madison's ruined silk gown without a second thought and crouched down in front of Maya. Jamal made a soft, reassuring sound, offering his hands to the little girl. Maya, sensing the gentle safety radiating from him, reached out with a bright smile. Jamal scooped her up with practiced ease, holding her securely in his arms. He stood tall, holding my daughter, and looked at Liam and me. In that silent exchange, a profound understanding was forged. Jamal was no longer just the man who had exposed my family's fraud. He was an honorary member of the family. Liam and I had built a chosen ally who had stood shoulder to shoulder with us in the trenches. Together, the 4 adults and 2 children turned toward the exit. We formed a united, unbreakable front, turning our backs permanently on the stage, the fraud, and the people who had tried to destroy us. The cavernous ballroom of the elite hotel stretched out before us, a long center aisle lined with the most powerful, ruthless, and influential figures in the city. These were venture capitalists who routinely bankrupted rivals before breakfast politicians, who thrived on scandal, and socialites who traded in secrets. They were a crowd that was notoriously difficult to impress and incredibly eager to tear people down. Yet as we began our walk toward the grand mahogany doors, the atmosphere in the room was completely transformed. There was no mocking laughter. There were no sneers of derision. Instead, a wave of profound, palpable respect swept through the gathered elite. As we took our first steps down the aisle, the impenetrable wall of billionaires and power brokers actually began to move. They shuffled backward, physically parting ways to create a wide, unobstructed path for us. Men who possessed more wealth than small countries stepped aside, dipping their heads in silent acknowledgement. Women dripping in diamonds shifted their posture, yielding the floor. It was a parting of the sea, a physical manifestation of the absolute dominance we had just displayed. As we walked, the oppressive silence was broken by quiet, deliberate murmurs. They were not gossip. They were statements of pure reverence. I caught the low rumble of a hedge fund manager whispering to his partner about the sheer tactical brilliance of Jamal's audit. I heard a prominent real estate developer quietly praise the absolute surgical precision of our legal execution. They recognized exactly what had transpired. We had not merely defended ourselves against a pack of grifters, we had dismantled them with a level of grace and lethal efficiency that commanded total awe. I kept my head held high, my posture immaculate, matching Liam's steady, confident pace. Jamal walked right beside us, carrying Maya, with a relaxed, joyful ease that directly mocked the devastation we were leaving in our wake. We moved past the overturned crystal champagne flutes, past the discarded hors d'oeuvres, and past the shocked, staring faces of the city's most dangerous players. We were walking through the absolute pinnacle of high society, and we owned every single inch of it. The heavy, ornate double doors of the banquet hall loomed ahead. They were massive constructs of dark mahogany and polished brass, representing the final barrier between my toxic past and my brilliant future. Liam reached out with his free hand, grasping the cool metal handle, and pushed. The doors swung open with a heavy, satisfying glide. The crisp, clean, freezing night air rushed into the stuffy, perfume-choked ballroom, hitting my face like a baptism. We stepped across the threshold, our shoes leaving the plush carpeting and making contact with the hard, real pavement outside. Behind us, the heavy doors swung shut on their hydraulic hinges. The thick wood met the doorframe with a solid, resonant thud. In an instant, the muffled, pathetic wailing of Cynthia, the hysterical screams of Madison, and the broken sobbing of Richard were completely severed. The noise was instantly extinguished, locked away in a tomb of their own making. I took a deep, unrestrained breath of the fresh night air, my lungs expanding fully for what felt like the first time in my life. The sky above was clear, the stars brilliant and sharp. Then the sound hit the cool night air. It started as a distant wail rising rapidly in pitch and volume. From the downtown avenue, the harsh, aggressive shriek of police sirens tore through the quiet evening. I looked toward the main road and saw the strobing, violent flashes of red and blue lights reflecting off the glass facades of the surrounding skyscrapers. The convoy of patrol cars was moving fast, converging directly on the luxury hotel. The elite corporate lawyers had delivered the foreclosure notices, but the authorities were arriving to deal with the rampant, undeniable financial fraud Richard had committed. I stood on the pavement holding my husband's hand, watching the flashing lights illuminate the darkness. Jamal stood beside us, bouncing Maya gently as she pointed at the colorful lights, completely unaware of the absolute justice they represented. I looked at the faces of my chosen family, feeling an overwhelming surge of profound peace. The sirens grew deafening, signaling the arrival of handcuffs, jail cells, and absolute ruin for the people who had tried to bury me. The chapter on my biological family was not just closed, it was burned to ash, scattered to the wind, and permanently erased from my world. 1 year is a remarkably short amount of time to fall from the absolute pinnacle of high society to the very bottom of the working class barrel. But Richard and Cynthia managed the descent with spectacular, agonizing speed. The federal investigation moved with ruthless efficiency, stripping them of every hidden asset, every luxury vehicle, and every last cent of their fraudulent corporate empire. To avoid lengthy prison sentences, Richard had accepted a brutal, ironclad plea deal that left them with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and a mountain of legal restitution they could never hope to repay in 10 lifetimes. Their current residence was a cramped, moldy studio apartment located above a noisy 24-hour laundromat in the most dilapidated section of the city. The peeling yellow wallpaper and the perpetual suffocating smell of bleach and damp rot was a far cry from the vaulted ceilings and imported marble of their former Beacon Hill mansion. Cynthia, who had once spent her leisurely afternoons sipping vintage champagne at the Oak Ridge Country Club, now spent her days standing on her feet for grueling 9-hour shifts at a discount retail store. She spent her hours scanning clearance items, folding cheap polyester shirts, and enduring the harsh complaints of angry bargain hunters. The thick, callous skin building on her aching heels was a constant, agonizing reminder of her new reality. Richard fared no better. Stripped of his corporate authority and permanently barred from ever holding a financial license again, he worked as a stock boy at a local hardware store. The man who had once commanded boardrooms was now reduced to hauling heavy boxes of nails and stacking bags of fertilizer under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. They spent their evenings in their tiny, suffocating room, screaming vicious, venomous insults at each other over the loud hum of a broken window, air conditioning unit, bitterly fighting over whose fault it was that their perfect illusion had shattered. Madison's fall from grace was perhaps the most poetic and devastating. Stripped of the fake medical clinic that had propped up her massive ego and completely abandoned by her wealthy husband, who had secured an immediate annulment the moment the fraud went public, she was left drowning in a sea of staggering personal debt. The golden child who had never been told no in her entire life was suddenly told no by every bank, every former socialite friend, and every high society connection she attempted to exploit for a bailout. She was entirely cut off, a total pariah in the elite circles she once ruled. Pure necessity forced her into the only job she could secure without a real degree or a reference. She now worked the grueling night shift at a greasy, neon-lit diner off the interstate. Her days of wearing designer gowns and spending hours on meticulous makeup contouring were replaced by a stained, ill-fitting polyester uniform and a mandatory hairnet. She spent her nights scrubbing congealed syrup off sticky vinyl booths and serving burnt coffee to weary, indifferent truck drivers. Her swollen feet ached relentlessly as she stood behind the cash register calculating how many hundreds of shifts she would need to work just to make the minimum payment on her maxed-out credit cards. The crushing, inescapable weight of her own absolute uselessness was her permanent companion. Meanwhile, an entirely different reality was unfolding, bathed in warm, golden afternoon sunlight. The sprawling, impeccably manicured backyard of our countryside estate was alive with the joyous, chaotic sounds of a childhood I had never been permitted to experience. We were celebrating Maya and Leo's 7th birthday, and the atmosphere was vibrant, entirely devoid of the toxic, performative stress that had defined every single gathering of my youth. Colorful banners hung from the branches of ancient oak trees, and a massive custom-built bounce house dominated the far lawn, echoing with the shrieks of happy children. Liam stood by the massive outdoor stone grill, effortlessly flipping burgers and laughing deeply at a joke Jamal had just made. Jamal had seamlessly transitioned from the ruthless forensic auditor who saved my life into a permanent, cherished fixture in our family. He was officially Uncle Jamal to the twins, a role he embraced with boundless enthusiasm. He had found his own peace, His independent consulting firm was thriving, and he was happily navigating the dating world again. He had brought his new partner, a brilliant and warm architect named Sarah, to the party. Watching them smile together completely at ease brought a profound sense of satisfaction to my chest. Jamal excused himself from the grill, dodging a stray water balloon thrown by one of Leo's friends, and ran across the grass. He swooped down, scooping Leo up into a dizzying, spinning hug that sent the 7-year-old into fits of ecstatic giggling. Maya was close behind, launching herself at Jamal's knees and demanding her turn to be spun, trusting him completely to catch her. I stood on the edge of the sprawling stone patio holding a glass of iced tea and watched the beautiful, vibrant life I had meticulously built. I watched my husband, whose unwavering loyalty and quiet strength had been my anchor through the darkest storms. I watched the man who had become my fiercest ally, bringing genuine, uninhibited joy to my children. I watched my twins completely free, completely safe, and entirely loved. They would never know the cold, sharp sting of conditional affection. They would never know the terror of a locked door, the humiliation of being tossed out into the freezing rain, or the agony of being told they were a disappointment. A gentle breeze swept across the estate, rustling the leaves of the oaks and carrying the sweet, smoky scent of the barbecue. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling an absolute, unshakable stillness in my soul. I thought back to the freezing, rat-infested warehouse where I had spent the bleakest years of my life. For so long, I had viewed that concrete box as a punishment, a cruel prison designed by my mother to break me down into nothingness. But looking at the unshakable empire of love, wealth, and loyalty surrounding me now, the truth crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. The warehouse had never been my prison. It was my crucible. The intense, agonizing pressure of that isolation and hardship had not destroyed me. It had burned away every weakness, every ounce of naive vulnerability, and every desperate need for their validation. It was the exact fire I needed to endure. Out of those bitter, freezing ashes, I had not emerged as a victim. I had forged a diamond, brilliant, unbreakable, and capable of cutting through anything that dared to stand in my way. I stepped back from the edge of the stone patio, letting the joyful sounds of my children playing fade into a gentle, comforting background hum. I turned away from the sprawling green lawns of my estate and looked directly forward, breaking through the invisible barrier separating my world from yours. I am looking right at the camera, right at you, because I know there is someone out there listening to this who is standing exactly where I stood 16 years ago. I know there is someone watching who is currently freezing in their own metaphorical rainstorm, clutching the shattered scraps of their dignity, wondering what on earth they did wrong to earn the hatred of the very people who were supposed to protect them. You are sitting in the dark, replaying every cruel insult, every unfair comparison, and every deliberate act of sabotage, desperately trying to figure out how to fix a dynamic that was broken long before you even realized it was a game. I want you to listen to me very carefully. You did not do anything wrong. You were simply cast in a role you never auditioned for by directors who needed a scapegoat to hide their own glaring insecurities and moral bankruptcies. For a very long time, I believed the pervasive lie that society force-feeds us from the moment we are born. We are relentlessly conditioned to revere the concept of biological relation. We are told that blood is thicker than water, that you only get one mother, that you must honor your father, and that siblings are your built-in best friends. The world demands absolute loyalty to these arbitrary genetic connections, even when those connections are actively poisoning your soul. Abusers know this societal rule perfectly. They use it as a weapon to keep you compliant and as a shield to deflect their own accountability. They rely on your guilt, your sense of obligation, and your desperate hardwired human craving for parental love to keep you tethered to their endless cycle of degradation. But looking at the life I have constructed, looking at the fierce loyalty of the husband who held my hand when I was a nameless girl in a freezing warehouse, and looking at the brilliant colleague who risked his career to help me expose a fraud, I have learned the absolute truth. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who chooses to stand with you when you have nothing, and who respects you when you have everything. Liam stood by me when I had absolutely zero capital, no social standing, and no future prospects. He saw the fire in my eyes and nurtured it, without ever once feeling threatened by its heat. He loved the penniless, abandoned teenager just as fiercely as he loves the wealthy, powerful CEO standing before you today. Jamal respected my intellect and my strategic mind long before he knew the depth of my bank accounts. He stood with me in the trenches of a corporate war, proving that shared values and mutual respect form a bond infinitely stronger than shared DNA. These men, along with my beautiful children, are my real family. We are bound by choice, by trust, and by a daily commitment to lift each other up. There is a pervasive, deeply damaging myth that cutting toxic people out of your life, especially your parents or your siblings, is a profound tragedy. People will whisper behind your back. Well-meaning but ignorant friends will urge you to be the bigger person, to reconcile, to let bygones be bygones, because life is short. They will try to impose their own healthy family dynamics onto your toxic reality, making you feel cold and ruthless for walking away. I am here to tell you with absolute certainty that cutting out toxic people isn't a tragedy. It's a necessary surgery for survival. If you had a gangrenous limb that was slowly spreading infection toward your heart, you would not hesitate to amputate it. You would not keep the rotting appendage simply because you were born with it. You would remove the poison to save the whole body. Severing ties with Cynthia, Richard, and Madison was not an act of malice. It was a life-saving emotional amputation. They were a creeping infection designed to drain my resources, crush my spirit, and demand my subservience while offering absolutely nothing but misery in return. Walking away from them, watching those heavy mahogany doors close on their weeping, pathetic faces, was the healthiest, most vital decision I have ever made. I look at the camera now, and I do not exude the nervous, fragile energy of a victim who barely survived. I exude the strength, the profound peace, and the ultimate victory of a woman who conquered her abusers and built an empire on the very ground they tried to bury her in. My mind is quiet. My heart is full. I sleep soundly every single night, completely free from the anxiety of navigating their manipulative games. I am untouchable not just because of my wealth, but because I finally recognized my own inherent, undeniable worth. You have that exact same power within you. You have the right to close the door on anyone who treats you like an option, an inconvenience, or a punching bag. You have the right to curate your inner circle with the ruthless precision of an elite gallery owner, allowing entry only to those who bring light, respect, and genuine love into your space. Sometimes the family you need isn't the one you were born into. It's the one you build from the ground up. Have you ever had to cut ties with your own blood to protect your self-worth? How did you survive the fallout? Share your story in the comments below. We read every single one. If my journey resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe, and remember, never let anyone convince you that you are anything less than brilliant. The most profound lesson from this story is that biological ties never justify abuse or toxic manipulation. Society conditions us to believe that blood is unbreakable, forcing victims to endure constant mistreatment. However, true family is forged through mutual respect, unwavering support, and chosen loyalty, not mere genetics. Walking away from relatives who consistently diminish your worth is not an act of cruelty. It is a vital surgery for your emotional survival. You possess the absolute right to protect your peace and curate a supportive inner circle. Share your own experiences with building your chosen family in the comments below.